Chapter 1401, Thermal Vision. The change didn't stop at the vertical pupils. Rodney's face began to match his eyes' bloodshot state since his skin tensed up as blood vessels expanded and rose, almost turning into scarlet wrinkles. That appearance reminded George of Khan's blood shield, but he didn't voice that comparison since the changes didn't stop at those superficial traits. Rodney's firm aura condensed and intensified, growing stronger and more primal. He exhaled loudly, the gesture almost sounding like a hiss, while his mana gained new properties that transformed how he felt in George's perception. Rodney was a 5th-level warrior with unclear battle prowess, but George knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that he could beat him in a fight. However, after injecting the syringe's contents, Rodney's mana had grown thicker, making his existence hard to pierce and gauge for George. It was as if Rodney's engine now had a new, superior fuel, similar to what the two Black Evolved warriors had achieved after ripping their horns off. Of course, the transformation's main feature wasn't about the sheer power boost it produced. That forceful, temporary mutation had a different goal, which George immediately checked. The intrusive, annihilating influence radiated by the two evolved warriors several blocks away kept reaching the broken terrace. Yet, Rodney's existence didn't shrink or disappear anymore under it. That wasn't complete immunity. George could sense Rodney's now thicker mana actively fighting against that annihilating influence. Still, it didn't immediately lose now. Rodney was enduring that ethereal face-off, confirming that his energy had lost its natural weakness toward the true chaos. George had already seen a few tests in action, but that scene set the matter in stone. The Allied front had truly found a way to fight the Scarlet Eyes on even ground. The method was still experimental, limited, and with drawbacks, but it brought hope in defeating that universal threat nonetheless. "Don't make me wait, Patriarch Ildu," Rodney announced, his stance stabilizing while his face retained those hideous features. "I can't deal with two evolved warriors on my own." After that, Rodney jumped off the terrace, his body free-falling toward the diagonal street one of the black aliens had cut open. He seemed about to crash into that shallow cavity, but his figure suddenly slowed down mid-air, allowing for a safe landing on that groove's edge. George watched as Rodney rushed forward, unaffected by the shallow rivers of black smoke on his path, before donning a frown. An irking sensation rose through his mind, almost prompting a displeased snort. Somehow, it had sounded like Rodney was in charge now, which George didn't like at all. A man can't even show off properly before someone comes to steal his spotlight. George cursed, that mental joke acting as his last attempt to make light of the situation before only leaving room for sharp resolve. George didn't hesitate anymore and stabbed his leg with the syringe, finally experiencing what it meant to mutate forcefully. A foreign substance that affected his flesh, mana, and very being quickly spread throughout his body, accompanied by a burning sensation that forced him to close his eyes. A piercing pain spread on several levels of George's existence. He had promised himself not to grunt to claim some mental superiority over Rodney, but his body reacted on its own to that invasion. George's sharpness wavered as his body tensed up. His mouth opened, releasing a hiss-like sound while something warm flowed out of his squeezed eyelids. His existence tried to fight against the foreign substance, only to fuse with it, remaining the same but also transforming. Primordial urges filled George's mind. He felt hungry, arrogant, and wild, with some of those feelings resonating with his character, attempting to alter his very personality. Yet, most of George's training had involved his spiritual and mental sides. He quickly put those wild emotions under control, streamlining and absorbing them into his being while focusing on other aspects of his existence. The annihilating influence from the two fuming evolved warriors was still there, but wasn't weightless anymore. It now featured a proper pressure, something George could use to sharpen himself even further. George's mana had reached a state where it could contend with the true chaos, so he relied on his previous technique to shed away even more impurities, touching upon power levels he had never witnessed during simple training. The process felt deceptively slow but was rather immediate. The silver light around George darkened, gaining an ominous, dangerous vibe, condensing over his figure while surpassing its previous limits. The terrace's surface suddenly became unable to endure George's sharpness. His feet and figure cut through that metal layer, sliding down the building's wall, effortlessly severing its fabric while gaining speed due to the lack of any meaningful opposition. The process seemed ready to continue even after George reached the first floor. His figure was prepared to cut through the cavity opened by the black silhouette and beyond, threatening to send him under the city's surface. Yet, George seized control of the new state of his existence before touching the street. No matter a sword's sharpness, a true swordman only cut what he wanted to cut, so his feet violently landed on the metal surface below without causing any damage. That heavy landing would have usually triggered a slight discomfort. After all, George had basically jumped out of a tall building without slowing down at all. However, George only felt boundless strength coursing through his veins and flesh. His legs didn't even bend to disperse the accumulated momentum. His figure remained straight, and his eyes managed to open now that the burning sensation had subsided. The world that appeared in George's vision wasn't what he remembered. Shades of green and blue had almost replaced every other color, only leaving room for something brighter and warmer. Foreign instincts fused with George's mind, updating him on the true nature of that bright warmth. He had gained thermal vision that joined his heightened senses, reacting to the symphony, turning the two alien evolved warriors into blinding stars in his now reptilian eyes. Chapter 1402, Envision Death. That strange, inhuman vision felt both natural and unnatural, but George couldn't dwell on it. The experimental mutagen's effects were temporary, making every second in that state priceless. Besides, the two blinding sources of warmth in the distance weren't alone. An even brighter, scorching presence was in the sky, while another slightly dimmer one was almost upon the former. Rodney had kept advancing toward the two evolved warriors, seemingly uncaring whether George was following him. Of course, knowing Rodney, that reckless charge disclosed his complete confidence in the fact that George would back him up. That awareness tried to annoy George, but that feeling couldn't exist in the new, sharp mental state he had reached. He moved his arm, gently pointing his sword forward, before his entire figure turned into a streak of dark silver light. The same technique George had relied upon to escape the nuke's explosions showed newfound speed after the mutagen tainted his existence. He instantly crossed several blocks, deepening the cavity opened by the black silhouette, surpassing and preceding Rodney in his arrival at their opponents. George had already picked his target, and a clinging noise resounded over the scorched and melted street when his silver sword slammed on two black blades. The burly, bald alien had reacted to his sudden charge, but the world couldn't survive that violent clash. Most of the cloud's smoke had spread toward more distant streets, only leaving shallow rivers in the area. Even with the flickering true chaos released by the two evolved warriors, that energy only reached below George's knees. Nevertheless, the clash between the three swords sent sharp energy everywhere, cutting through the smoke lingering on the street and severing its very fabric, forcing it to disperse into the air. The clash cleared the street, but neither George nor his bald opponent cared about those consequences. The two seemed to enter a contest of sheer strength, pushing on their respective blades to overpower their opponent, which George surprisingly endured thanks to the mutagen. Of course, George immediately felt he had no chance to overpower the evolved warrior physically, but that had never been his goal. He was no mace, hammer, or other blunt instruments. George was a sword, probably the sharpest blade currently on Earth. To the bald alien's surprise, the clash didn't end with him squashing the silver swordsman. Instead, his superior physical strength worked against him in ways he couldn't have possibly conceived, especially after breaking his horn. The black swords had initially stopped the silver blade, only for the latter to pierce them slowly. George's sharpness cut through those dark weapons, threatening to sever them to advance toward the alien's neck. The burly alien began to react, but it was already too late. The silver sword suddenly cut through the black blade in his left hand, tilting to lunge at his head. An explosion of thick black smoke happened on the building to George's left. His opponent had disappeared before his blade could pierce his skull, but drops of black blood flowed down its silver tip, conveying the attack's partial success. The smoke on the building flickered outward before the bald alien crossed it, wielding 1.5 blades, his now scarlet eyes showing vague hints of seriousness. A long cut had opened on his cheek, but true chaos blew out of the wound, immediately fixing it. "You aren't that strong when I can use my mana," George mocked, instinctively using similar words to those Khan had spoken to the two alien scouts. "I guess the true chaos can't heal you if I cut off your head." The blue-green thermal vision wasn't as detailed as George's previous one, but he still saw the following development with uncanny precision. Heat gathered on the severed sword and all around the bald alien, giving birth to multiple items George couldn't help but recognize. Curse my big mouth, George chuckled as multiple black swords surrounded the alien evolved warrior, floating in the air and joining the two in his hands. Ah, well, George sighed. It would have been strange if it were any easier. Meanwhile, on a nearby but different spot of that charred, melted street, Rodney and the leaner, long-haired, evolved warrior stared at each other, seemingly inspecting their respective power. A storm of clinging noises reached the area as George and his opponent engaged in a heated succession of quick exchanges. The world kept splitting around them as their swords clashed, cutting through streets, smoke, and buildings, distancing them from their companions. Still, neither Rodney nor the leaner alien seemed to care. Despite the former being on the clock, the two kept staring at each other, waiting for their opponent to make the first move. Rodney's calm face didn't reflect his hurry at all. His brown reptilian eyes moved between the face partially hidden by that long black hair and the seemingly aware creature made of smoke coiled around the alien's right arm. That denser trail of smoke had enlarged after the alien ripped off his horn, absorbing part of the true chaos. Its bigger tip had even gained a vagalips-shaped cavity, seemingly acting as a toothless mouth. Moreover, the leaner alien exerted some control over the surrounding smoke, even saving it from the sharp energy released from the previous sword clashes. A pile of lighter true chaos rested behind the evolved warrior, towering over his figure, ready to crash down on Rodney like one of the waves that had submerged the city. Of course, Rodney realized that smoke could have other uses, which probably had something to do with the gaseous shape coiled around the alien's arm. Yet, that uncertainty didn't affect Rodney's confidence. He remained as stern and firm as always, his reptilian eyes betraying profound machinations that culminated in words. Humankind is aware of your understanding of this language, Rodney announced, his mutated mana fusing with his voice, conveying emotions to speak in the Nax language. So, I'll use it to warn you. The long-haired alien obviously didn't acknowledge that point. He didn't even react to the announcement. He kept staring at Rodney, harboring thoughts only he could be aware of. Attack me however you want, Rodney challenged. Throw anything you have at me and hope to kill me in time. Because the moment I can envision your death, it will turn into reality. Chapter 1403, Thoughts. The leaner alien's face remained still and emotionless at the challenge, but his body finally moved. His left arm rose, and trails of the rising tide of smoke behind him flew forward to condense above his figure. The smoke didn't only condense. It also morphed into more physical objects that Rodney was almost worried would turn into something similar to the alien lover's spell he had seen everywhere on the network. Luckily, the alien evolved warrior had enough decency not to create spears. His trails of smoke took circular shapes, which pulsated as if they were beating hearts before releasing bullets made of raw true chaos. Shield, Rodney thought as the rain of bullets crashed on him. Nothing appeared, but none of the whooshing, pitch-black bullets hit Rodney. They all landed on something invisible before him, releasing their smoke and power on a non-existent surface that kept him safe. The alien evolved warrior wasn't dumb enough to limit his offensive to Rodney's front. His fuming circles spread out, surrounding Rodney and raining fire on him from every direction. Yet, that invisible barrier kept blocking them. That invasive, annihilating smoke spread all around Rodney, encircling and trapping him in pitch-black darkness. Still, his vertical pupils stared back at that abyss, relying on his new alien vision to study as many details as possible. The Scarlet Eye's capabilities were still a mystery. Their true chaos was indeed troublesome, but the Allied front also had to account for each of their evolved troops' fighting methods. It would have been easier if those invaders all shared the same fighting patterns, but Rodney had to crush those hopes himself. To that day, he had only seen 4 of those evolved warriors in action, and they all relied on different abilities on top of the troublesome element. Of the 2 scouts the alien lover had fought, one relied more on imitating his opponent's abilities, creating stronger replicas through the true chaos. Meanwhile, the other scout had a more primal battle style, resembling a clawed and fanged beast rather than an existence at the peak of the known power classification. The 2 evolved warriors who had invaded Aina followed that trend. One summoned and wielded swords, while the other seemed to rely on his control of the pitch-black smoke to create all sorts of attacks. The only similarities Rodney could spot involved the Scarlet Eye's sex and their ability to warp through vast patches of space. After all, both attacks had only involved what looked like males, and they could all rely on those ellipse-shaped teleports to a certain extent. Nevertheless, those apparent similarities were closer to hypotheses than actual conclusions. 4 evolved warriors were too small a pool to obtain clear answers and draw precise rules about that universal threat. Also, one hypothesis was relatively useless. Even if the Scarlet Eyes only featured males, the Allied front wouldn't be able to do much with that information. As for the other hypothesis, Rodney was more inclined to believe that the ellipse-shaped teleports came from the true chaos rather than the Scarlet Eyes' individual skills. Some might be better than others in that ability, but that would change little in the enemy's profiling. The barrage of black bullets was short-lived. The long-haired evolved warrior sensed its inability to hit its target and stopped wasting energy, retrieving the pulsating circles, making them rest above his figure. Tongues of flickering smoke kept surrounding Rodney, but he softly exhaled when he felt he had seen enough, thinking about something and fueling that process with his modified mana to cast a spell. The soft wisp of air Rodney had released turned into a gale that blew away the surrounding black smoke, freeing him from its encirclement. His spell also cleared a piece of the street, but his vertical eyes promptly went back to his alien opponent. "Why circles?" Rodney asked, relying on the alien language he had gone out of his way to learn after seeing the footage with the 2 black scouts. "Wasn't your species fond of ellipses?" The long-haired alien remained impassible, but his following attack acted as a reply to Rodney's question. The pulsating circles above his figure melted and fused into a long black line that opened as if imitating eyelids. A large ellipse took shape above the evolved warrior, featuring nothing but distant, inscrutable darkness within. Still, glowing blackness soon approached the threshold from the other side, releasing a beam-like attack that dimmed the surrounding light. The beam was too fast to allow any meaningful inspection. Rodney had to thank his mutated eyes for giving him the chance to notice and react to it. However, Rodney didn't summon his shield again nor deploy an evasive maneuver. He only had enough time for a single thought, so he used that chance to expand his window. Overdrive, Rodney thought, adding mana to the idea he had trained and tested countless times, succeeding in casting it before the beam could wash over his defenseless figure. The world in Rodney's reptilian eyes slowed down, almost coming to a halt. Except for his brain, his body matched that slow motion, only allowing him to brainstorm at an unfathomable pace. The beam was almost upon Rodney, slowly advancing toward his head. Its denser, bright blackness tried to erode his mana, depleting his reserves. It also added pressure on his mental technique, making his brain burn. The scorching sensation was so intense that his head would release grey smoke if it could. Nevertheless, Rodney pushed the pain aside and kept inspecting the attack. He couldn't point his reptilian eyes at the beam in that state, but his peripheral vision was enough to study its fabric. The beam was obviously stronger than the previous rain of bullets. It was a superior attack, but it shared features with the weakest version of the Scarlet Eye's true chaos. Besides, Rodney was half convinced the beam and the bullets hadn't suited his opponent's inclinations. Break, Rodney thought when he felt his mental limits approaching, and the world in his eyes resumed flowing at a normal pace. The dark but bright beam crashed on Rodney, only for its fabric to split and shatter, turning into a harmless black gale that blew over him before dispersing on the melted street. Rodney reached for his nose when he felt something warm flowing down his nostrils. He wiped off the few drops of blood descending toward his upper lip, but didn't forget to add another tactical challenge. "You must have a deeper degree of control over the true chaos," Rodney announced, still relying on the Nax language. "But your real abilities exist to create quasi-alive beings through it, don't they?" Chapter 1404, Miracle. Preys had no right to exist in the presence of predators. Even their sole attempts to fight back were an insult to the food chain. Their only right was to run away, struggling to survive another day. That was what the children of the mana were for the Scarlet Eyes. The true chaos was a superior energy, a natural enemy and predator for those inferior beings. The latter had also lost the god, so their only purpose was to become livestock now. Of course, the mana had spread and had given birth to different iterations of itself. It also seemed to have attempted to create an existence similar to the true chaos progenitor. Yet, how could a mere experiment match the true chaos god? The children of mana's inferiority was set in stone, so the long-haired alien couldn't waste his superior energy to wipe out such brittle beings. It would be an insult to his king and the god above him. Rodney's state was even more insulting. The long-haired alien could accept that the Silver Swordsman was somehow worthy of his true power, but his opponent was beyond unassuming. Their existences stood on levels so distant that attempted comparisons would be heresy. Nevertheless, Rodney was proving himself to be quite resilient, albeit not only by virtue of his personal power. The long-haired evolved warrior sensed the strange mutation that had infected and empowered that mana. It was similar to the previous explosions but featuring far denser and intense effects. That temporary attempt to surpass the mana's limits was working, but the long-haired evolved warrior felt he had seen enough. After all, he couldn't indulge in time-consuming inspections. His time wasn't his own to waste. It belonged to his king. The ellipse broke down into trails of smoke under Rodney's attentive gaze, which didn't return to the tide of true chaos behind the evolved warrior. Instead, tongues of the true chaos flickering on the evolved warrior's figure rose, fusing with the released smoke and claiming more of it from the tide behind him. The smoke condensed and brightened, radiating more of that black light as objects similar to the one coiled around the alien's right arm took shape. 9 trails of smoke finished condensing above the evolved warrior, their bloated tips turning toward Rodney as their worm-like bodies kept slithering in the air. Elliptical cavities also opened in those head-like features, creating toothless, hungry maws. The attack came without warning. The 9 gaseous worms rushed toward Rodney, splitting to encircle him and attack from different directions. They were slower than the beam, but Rodney only had to look at their heat signatures to know that their power was several levels above it. Still, the world in Rodney's reptilian eyes slowed down again as his brain went into overdrive. An even thicker storm of thoughts rushed through his mind, performing countless calculations that accounted for his physical prowess, casting speed, and more. The 9 gaseous worms seemed to oppose that invisible, ethereal technique. Theoretically, the spell only involved Rodney's brain, hastening its functions far beyond its limits to create that slow-motion effect. Yet, the 9 worms' thicker influence somehow affected the spell, reducing its effects, getting faster with each mental second Rodney spent in his inspection. The 9 spells didn't only look alive. They also seemed to possess some awareness and perception, sensing the accelerated inspection landing on their fabric and instinctively opposing it. As for how the 9 worms did that, Rodney couldn't know. Those fields were for the alien lover and his scornful wife to study. He only had to find a way out of his predicament earlier than planned. More blood flowed out of Rodney's nostrils as his body started to move. Mana occasionally rang in his brain, sending effects to the world and his flesh to aid his moves without ever interrupting the overdrive. One of the worms attacked Rodney from behind, targeting his nape. Yet, he swiftly tilted his torso, dodging the charge by less than a centimeter. 2 more of those gaseous creatures attacked Rodney from his right side, where he had tilted his torso, only for him to half-turn his waist, narrowly sliding between them. 3 more flew directly at Rodney, even adjusting their trajectory to his recent moves. Still, that was within his calculations. He had actually already released the spells necessary to counter them. The world and Rodney's flesh worked in unison, driven by the energy he had released earlier. His body seemed to move on its own, pushed by precise forces that half-turned him again, making him duck while propelling him forward. Rodney somehow slipped under the 3 frontal attacks, which ended up crashing into the remaining worms coming from his left. He had escaped the barrage, but his calculations didn't end there, and 2 donging noises resounded in his burning brain, giving him the strength and speed to see them through. Rodney suddenly accelerated, instantly closing the short distance that separated him from the evolved warrior, his arm stretched forward as one of his fingers pointed at that black head. Everything had been perfect, swift, sudden, and optimized to the extreme. Rodney didn't waste a single second dodging the attack and delivering a counterattack. However, Rodney soon became unable to see the black alien since the figure coiled around his right arm had appeared on his path, enlarging several times and pointing its now huge, elliptical mouth at him. Rodney couldn't have been faster or more perfect, but even his best performance had been useless against that opponent. The gap between mortals and evolved warriors was immense, and Rodney couldn't fill it despite the mutagen's effect. To make things worse, Rodney's momentum wasn't something he could disperse easily. He was in a crash course toward the now huge elliptical mouth, and his best calculations couldn't see him escaping it unscathed. Reality itself had doomed Rodney, forcing him to resort to a spell he had hoped not to use so early, if at all. Everything indeed pointed toward his death, but reality was a brittle thing when it came to his element. Miracle, Rodney thought, and the evolved warrior lost track of him, only for a painful sensation to spread from his nape. Chapter 1405, Imagination. Incredible speed could give birth to what looked like instantaneous movements, but some time still had to pass for a body to change location, no matter how infinitesimal. Even teleports weren't exactly instantaneous. Depending on their casting speed and the period a body required to stabilize in its new location, they could be faster or slower than sprints. They were immediate by every definition of the word, but still demanded some time. Also, be it sprint or teleports, they both left tracks that warriors could spot or react to, depending on the sharpness of their senses. In a way, every technique abided by a certain balance, featuring advantages and disadvantages, making nothing in the universe undeniably perfect. Nevertheless, the evolved warrior felt to have witnessed something that proved that notion wrong, albeit with some caveats. Despite the accumulated momentum, Rodney had vanished from his position, as if he had never been there in the first place. At the same time, Rodney had instantly appeared behind the evolved warrior, again as if he had always been there. It was as if the previous evasive maneuver and sprint had been nothing more than an illusion, but the black alien saw through those deceptive clues. Everything about the exchange was still there. The 9 gaseous, worm-like creatures showed signs of their previous assault, and the same went for the mana Rodney had released to slip through it. However, any trace of Rodney's existence disappeared right before the vast, elliptical mouth. Instead of crashing into the alien evolved warrior's main creature, Rodney had vanished without releasing any noticeable energy. The event defied reason, but the answers lay elsewhere. The world indeed had no leftovers from techniques, spells, or unfathomable sprints, but the fabric of reality seemed shaken, almost looking more confused than the evolved warrior. Rodney couldn't stop himself in time to dodge the huge elliptical mouth. He couldn't even come out of the crash unscathed. Nothing he wielded or knew could save him from that exchange, let alone allow him to come out on top, so he had changed reality itself. Nevertheless, the miraculous technique had limits. Rodney had unleashed a spell that couldn't be dodged since it came into existence directly as complete, but the attack itself was lacking for similar reasons. Rodney felt tired beyond reason while standing behind his opponent, his arm stretched at his fuming nape. Blood rained down his nostrils, but his brain burned too much to capture that sensation, and even his enhanced, reptilian vision narrowed, its edges blurring, seemingly hinting at imminent fainting. Still, Rodney was no stranger to that terrible condition. He had trained himself to endure it, and the power boost from the Great Old One's mutagen greatly helped, even if only to make him aware of his failure. Rodney's piercing finger had hit its target, cutting through the dense, glowing smoke on the alien's back and strands of his hair to reach his nape. Yet, the impact on that black skin didn't go as well. Rodney's fingertip had indeed pierced the alien's nape, but only slightly. The cut wasn't even a centimeter deep, and black smoke was already flowing out of the shallow wound, closing it. A single drop of black blood had fallen from it, but the bleeding had stopped at that. The scene was quite disappointing, considering that Rodney had to pull off an actual miracle to get that far. However, that conclusion was also understandable. Rodney could think of himself being behind the black alien, but his brain failed to imagine his finger stabbing through that black neck. Part of it was due to the ethereal opposition Rodney had witnessed with the 9 gaseous creatures. The evolved warrior was instinctively surrounded by something even stronger, which hindered Rodney's technique, limiting what his brain could imagine despite those thoughts only happening in his mind. Moreover, Rodney had yet to test, study, and find ways to overcome the evolved warrior's natural and artificial defenses. He couldn't imagine what he didn't know. Actually, he could try, but the consequences would be disastrous if miscalculations happened. Ultimately, Rodney had his inferiority to blame. Even without pulling off miracles, his attack would have killed or, at least, done more damage if he were as strong as the alien lover's greatest fan, swinging his sword at some distance away from him. Yet, Rodney didn't meet any of those requirements, so his attack failed. His first one, that was. Rodney fought against his burning brain to forcefully retract his arm, slamming his elbow on the tide of smoke behind him. He knew how that substance worked, so his attack released a shockwave that spread through it and affected its very fabric. What followed precisely matched Rodney's imagination. The tide of smoke froze before losing its structural integrity, dispersing in the sky and revealing the previously submerged, melted building. The alien moved, prompting Rodney to retreat. He stepped aside a few times, putting some distance from his opponent, only to discover that the latter had never planned to attack him. The evolved warrior reached for his nape, diving through his intact and severed black strands and smoke to search for the drop of blood still on his neck. He retrieved it, retracting his hand to study it under his scarlet eyes, seemingly interested in the fact that he could bleed. Of course, Rodney didn't dare to hope that his opponent could have such a glaring weakness. His money was on the fact that his technique had surprised the alien. After all, his element was quite magical, and he had even pushed it into realms that defied rational thinking. Yet, Rodney soon realized he would have lost that bet. The evolved warrior calmly turned toward him, stretching his right arm to let his main gaseous creature coil around it again, before showing his calm face and doing the unthinkable. The evolved warrior's thin lips parted, releasing a sound that Rodney's brain translated without relying on his newfound knowledge of the Nax language. Imagination, the black alien said, telling Rodney that he had him and his power figured out. Chapter 1406, Gods. The alien's sound confirmed what humankind had only guessed from the video the Nichols had shared. Even without relying on special techniques, humans could understand what the Scarlet Eye said. Of course, Rodney wasn't in the mood to rearrange his mental notes about that universal threat. His brain wasn't only on fire. Those huge drawbacks also served the sole purpose of telling his opponent about his secrets. Imagination was one possible interpretation of Rodney's element. He preferred thoughts as a definition, but both worked and didn't at the same time. Rodney's mana turned his thoughts into action, basically manifesting what his imagination could produce. In its infancy, that element had only been able to cause short, simple events, like a destabilizing noise. Still, its power had grown together with Rodney's understanding of its uses and limits. Theoretically, imagination had no limit, except that every action required a specific force, or forces in Rodney's case. His spells didn't only affect his mana reserves. His mind also played a primary role since it bore the weight of what he summoned, making his mental capacity and resilience critical variables. The mana reserves were easy enough to expand. Rodney had no shortage of wealth, and his connections to criminal and lawful forces had given him access to all kinds of resources. He had even relied on Balway's supplement to reach the 5th level. Meanwhile, the mental side had been tough to improve. Humankind had an extensive list of workout routines that could improve mental resilience and precision, which Khan had also relied upon in his first attempts to control the chaos element. Yet, Rodney also needed creativity, which no training could manufacture. Rodney was a shady but frugal man. He prioritized practicality over grand showcases of power. He didn't need vast barrages of destructive spears when a simple, well-timed, and precise attack could achieve the same results. Nevertheless, it was unwise not to master an element, so Rodney had tested himself countless times, abiding by his natural inclinations to discover his limits and capabilities. Sadly, Rodney quickly realized he had no creativity at all. He was good with plans and schemes, but they all needed real pawns and variables. Still, that also became his main advantage. Sticking to reality gave Rodney's training a proper direction. As long as something was theoretically possible, he could imagine it and make it real. Rodney also discovered that the mana consumption and mental pressure were lighter when he only affected himself, culminating in his best technique. Rodney could imagine himself being behind the black alien, so his spell had made it real. His previous momentum, position, and direction didn't matter. It was theoretically possible that he could manifest himself in a different location, so it happened. As long as I can think it, Rodney explained, still using the Nax language to speak, I can make it real. I can even bend reality to a certain extent. Obviously, Rodney had a reason for engaging in that conversation and revealing more details about his element. He was buying himself time to cool down his burning brain. Chances were he would have to use his miracles often, so he planned to seize all the breaks the fight gave him. You need time to make my death real, the alien evolved warrior said, if you have enough life to pay the price, son of the mana. The alien's statement hit home once again. Rodney indeed needed to gather more data to envision his opponent's death. The latter's capabilities were still too vague for Rodney's mind to create that reality. "You are correct, warrior of the true chaos," Rodney confirmed. "I actually can try to kill you right away, but I'll die if my calculations are incorrect, so keep using your abilities. I need hard data." That was another drawback of Rodney's element. Affecting himself was fine. He knew exactly what he was made of and how much energy he needed for each action. However, affecting another being always featured barriers, which became steep mountains to overcome when it came to mighty warriors. Realistically, imagining a headless version of the alien evolved warrior wasn't hard. Yet, turning that thought into reality featured countless hurdles and limitations. Living beings posed innate opposition to forces trying to affect them, and Rodney had felt them even without doing anything of the sort with his opponent. Rodney could test his luck anyway, but the attempted spell would use more mana to compensate for eventual variables, risking taking his own life before it could turn into reality. "Imagination is the weapon of the lost," the alien warrior said through a simple breath. "The sons of the mana must rely on dreams now that the god is dead." The evolved warrior didn't care about the destroyed tide of smoke and sent his fuming true chaos toward the gaseous creature on his arm. The latter had shrunk to return there, but its size increased again, coiling around his whole body and settling its head on his left shoulder. "There are no gods," Rodney responded, almost forgetting he was buying himself time to recover. "None worth worshipping anyway." A sharp, ringing noise resounded in the area, attempting to make the evolved warrior's pointy ears bleed. The alien easily endured the attack, only to discover that his gaseous creature and the smoke flowing over his figure were the actual target. The true chaos flickered intensely, seemingly struggling against the influence radiated by the specific noise, making the alien unable to control it, theoretically leaving him defenseless against the imminent attack. Rodney exploited that window to charge at the alien, his attack aided by the mutated mana released by his burning brain. His figure became a blur, suddenly appearing before the evolved warrior and taking him by surprise. Nevertheless, despite another perfect execution of a series of tricks and well-timed gestures, the alien remained stronger and faster. He didn't need any external true chaos to react to the attack. Rodney had pointed his sharp fingers at his skull, but a black hand was already on his wrist, trapping him in place. The alien didn't limit himself to keeping Rodney still. The gaseous figure on his shoulder was more resilient than the fuming true chaos on him, recovering quickly and shooting toward Rodney. The elliptical mouth instantly enveloped Rodney's head. Its gaseous maws were about to close when a single word resounded from inside them. "Miracle," Rodney uttered, voicing his thoughts to change reality once again. Chapter 1407, Trap. On a different side of the battlefield, George was in quite a terrible predicament. Black blurs flew at George from every direction, often simultaneously, making his arm swing left and right like crazy, giving birth to a cacophony of clinging noises that showed no end in sight. Things didn't end there. George had to remain utterly focused on his position and fighting stance, adjusting both at every swing to avoid getting cornered. His superb mastery of the sword was in full display there, but that did little to improve his situation. George had already proven himself more skilled as a swordsman than his opponent. His sharpness had even surpassed the fuming state the bald alien had achieved after breaking his horn. Yet, the battle had forced George into a defensive stance he saw no hope of escaping. In ancient times, a single sword was considered superior to dual wielding. The former was easier to master, offered more flexibility, and featured no clear disadvantages while retaining all the advantages the latter might provide. The rules had changed once the mana joined the fray. Suddenly, swordsmen weren't limited to their physical and mental prowess anymore. They could achieve superhuman states, relying on techniques to compensate, or even nullify, certain disadvantages that accompanied dual wielding. Of course, the same applied to a single sword. With no clear disadvantages to compensate for, swordsmen could focus solely on enhancing their already strong points, leaving it as the superior and preferred fighting style. George was utterly convinced of that point, too. He had researched the topic extensively, even performing tests and achieving partial, if not full, mastery in different styles. If something could be better than wielding a single sword, he would have switched to it. Nevertheless, evolved warriors abided by rules that went beyond what the mana had brought or what George could study. Also, George's opponent wasn't exactly ordinary in that, either. The alien-evolved warrior's physical strength surpassed George's, and the hovering black swords around him shared that feature, acting as an extension of his body. Moreover, the glowing, black smoke flickering over the alien's figure seemed to enhance his mental capabilities, allowing him to perfectly control all his swords, coordinating them in a battle formation that unleashed a relentless, flawless assault. With that, any disadvantage the alien might have suffered from by fighting with so many swords was gone. The description of a dual wielder didn't fit the predicament anymore. George felt as if he was against multiple opponents, which their bodiless state turned into an otherwise impossible battle formation. George couldn't win against that. He occasionally cut a black sword, only for the true chaos to fix it. That numerical advantage also more than compensated for the gap in raw skills, making any attempt to rely on it to defeat the alien impossible. The only silver lining was that sharp forces accompanied each clinging noise. The silver and black swords released ethereal slashes whenever they clashed, clearing the area of any obstacle before the battle could move there. Still, that trend didn't bode well for George. He was stuck in that defensive stance while also constantly retreating. He was even on the clock, even more so than his opponent was, forcing him to change his approach. After another deflection, George's left arm reached for the silver sword, wielding it with both hands. His battle stance also changed, becoming firmer and less nimble, sacrificing the agility that had kept him alive against that endless barrage. Of course, that sacrifice had a specific, evident purpose. The ominous dark silver aura that surrounded George intensified. His existence's sharpness skyrocketed, and each of his moves grew swifter and more precise, albeit while losing a certain flexibility. Still, the bald alien instantly realized the dangers of that new stance. He kept assaulting George with his endless barrage of black swords, but each one of them split upon clashing with the silver blade. George had already severed the black swords a few times, but that became the norm now. Each of his swings cut one of the fuming blades in half, consistently severing through that barrage. The fuming blades didn't follow metal weapons' usual rules. Even after cutting them in half, their sharp fabric kept advancing for a while, occasionally reaching George. Yet, George let those fuming shards land on him, adjusting his stance to narrowly dodge them, uncaring of the shallow cuts that opened on his face, shoulders, arms, sides, and legs. Needless to say, George wouldn't survive that trend for long, but he couldn't see other viable options. The barrage was impossible to overcome with his current strength, so he would cut through it. The alien had obviously accounted for that possibility, but George surpassed his expectations. George lost himself in that dance of deadly blades, each of his swings becoming swifter and deadlier than the previous. George wasn't a mere sword anymore. He didn't limit himself to being the sharpest weapon on Earth, either. He became a blade with the sole purpose of piercing through that storm of fuming edges, becoming one with its rhythm, attuning with it, flowing to create and tread the narrow path to victory. As George kept getting faster, the bald alien's assault began to lose momentum. At first, only one of his black swords remained in its split state before the true chaos fixed it, but their number gradually increased. Clinging noises stopped resounding in the area. Each one of George's slashes cut through the air and fuming metal. Shallow wounds littered his body, tainting his shirt and trousers with patches of blood, but his advance only hastened, eventually leading him before his opponent. The bald alien looked uncharacteristically surprised, but George was in no state to notice or mind that detail. 8 severed swords hovered around and behind him. The intact ones were too far from him or were wielded by his opponent. It didn't look like it, but his path was clear. George performed his swiftest attack yet. His silver blade slashed diagonally, cutting through the 2 black swords in the alien's hands, facing no opposition at all. The slash aimed to split the alien's head diagonally and take his neck and the right side of his chest with it. The silver edge even touched the evolved warrior's temple, but a clinging noise resounded at that point. The impact on the alien's temple revealed the true nature of his skin. A scaled pattern replaced his smooth face, each of those oval shapes resembling metal shards, almost acting as a mana-enhanced chainmail. George could still cut through that innate armor, but the latter inevitably delayed his attack. That wasn't enough to bring the other swords in the barrage upon him, but the alien had something else in store. To George's surprise, a black blade had come out of the alien's torso while he was busy finishing his slash. The same black skin that had stopped his sword was liquid there, allowing the new weapon to cross it so seamlessly that its sharp tip was already upon the center of George's chest. Chapter 1408, Fulfilled Man. George realized he had made a mistake, a fatal one at that. His strategy had been perfect, and the same went for his execution. He had surpassed his limits by leaps and bounds, improving as a swordsman in the process. Yet, George had also built that strategy upon a flawed foundation. He had believed the bald alien had already shown most of his power and abilities, which turned out to be wrong. Of course, George had accounted for and had been ready for variables, but the evolved warrior had also been perfect. His sneaky counterattack couldn't have had better timing. That truth was so evident that even George's subconscious realized it. George's arms had moved on their own throughout the battle, but remained still now. His entire being understood how hopeless his predicament was, making any attempt to escape it pointless. The silver blade rested on the alien's seemingly scaled head, unable to pierce the tough defense. Meanwhile, the black sword coming out of the evolved warrior's torso had already reached the center of George's chest and was less than a second away from piercing it. Evolved warriors existed past their physical limits, fearing injuries to their existence more than those to their flesh and organs. However, George didn't belong to that realm. His sharpness might affect superior existences, and the mutagen had also improved his physical stats, but he knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that he would die once the black sword pierced his chest. I should have really fooled around for a few more decades, George cursed, his perception of time slowing down in that instant before his death, stretching it to allow more thoughts. A mental curse accompanied that thought. Despite George's best efforts, his mind couldn't dwell on such hedonistic, superficial pleasures at all. Very different images filled his reptilian vision, adding colors that the mutagen had robbed him of. Among all the mindless sex, exhilarating drunken nights, and incredible excesses, George ended up recalling a seemingly random, simple, and quiet moment. George had been on a vast and comfortable bed that night, and, for reasons he couldn't remember, Michael had decided to hop on it, ultimately falling asleep. Anita was also in that nostalgic, peaceful scene. She was less pregnant than she was now, but her slightly bloated belly was already visible while she slept sideways at George's side, their son lying between them. And that was it. That was all George's brain could muster now that death was coming. It didn't even bother to picture Anita naked, but George knew he wanted nothing more in the world. He had forsaken his place on the battlefield years ago, making that silent but cozy bed his new home. What I'd give to get back there and be done with all this stuff, George mentally sighed, finding no reason to deny his true desires during his last moments. Despite George's best efforts, he had truly become a decent man. All his teasing, joking, and complaining had no honesty behind it. He loved his married, peaceful life and wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. Nevertheless, being a decent man meant upholding specific duties, especially for someone in George's position. He wasn't a simple husband and father. His family had elected him patriarch, and his status in the Allied front surpassed even that. As much as George wished to be a simple family man and, at most, fool around with friends, he simply couldn't. He couldn't yet, at least. As long as the Scarlet Eyes threat existed, the universe needed him for one reason or another. Still, the battle against the bald, evolved warrior had shown an irrefutable truth. George could hold his own against the Scarlet Eyes warriors, and probably even defeat one, but that was his limit. In his current state, he was inconsequential to the state of the battlefield. I really hoped doing this would have kept me away from the battlefield forever, George mentally cursed. One battle, one kill, and commanding behind a desk for the rest of this war. What a good plan that was. Of course, that had never been the idea behind George's intervention, but it was a possibility, especially after confirming that he was outclassed. That wasn't his world anymore. He didn't belong there and didn't want to belong. I wish I could have seen my daughter, George realized. She'll be the envy of every princess, just like my little lady killer will make them all fall for him. Such cheap genes. Pride inevitably spread through George's mind. He couldn't have asked for a better wife and children. He was sure his daughter would be perfect, too. He was also certain she would be safe. You could have tried to come back a little earlier, George mentally sighed, his thoughts moving elsewhere, going toward the only other person outside his family that could appear in his mind during those last moments. The brother-in-arms who had accompanied George ever since they were little more than kids would keep his family safe. That wasn't in question. If anything, George almost felt bad for anyone who even thought about doing something fishy. I almost feel bad for these aliens, too, George mentally chuckled. They have no idea what they have unleashed by killing me. The black tip had pierced George's skin by then, making its way through his rib cage. Just make sure to listen to Lisa, George thought. She knows it's not your fault. Believe her like you always do. A different, less experienced, or unfulfilled man would be overwhelmed by unwillingness in those final moments. Still, George found no point in souring his feelings over matters he couldn't affect or change. George knew his death was set in stone. He would need a proper miracle to get out of that predicament in one piece, and that wistful thinking had no place on the battlefield. Therefore, George only focused on the good, knowing that he couldn't have been happier about his life. He would die a fulfilled man, certain that his only desire was more time to enjoy what he already had. However, something suddenly materialized between George and the burly warrior. Rodney appeared out of nowhere, his bloodied hand already closed on the rising black sword, delaying its advance, giving George the time to complete his slash. Chapter 1409, Inspiration. Turning time back a little, focusing on the other pair of human and alien evolved warrior engaged in a deadly battle. Rodney's situation had degenerated quickly after the alien had started fighting him for real. He had kept himself alive through a mixture of skillful planning, perfectly executed strategies, and straight-up miraculous, reality-bending spells. Nevertheless, the effort had left Rodney wounded, exhausted beyond reason, and not a step closer to defeating his opponent than he was several exchanges ago. Rodney's utmost tidy military uniform had turned into a mess of torn rags. Something had eaten away a piece of the clothes covering his waist, exposing his abs and leaving a shallow, horizontal cut on them. The entirety of the right leg of Rodney's trousers had also disappeared, the shoe included. Finger-sized holes even littered it, releasing blood that didn't show signs of stopping flowing. Still, the worst offender there was Rodney's left arm. Something had eaten away half of his sleeve, together with the skin over his forearm, almost exposing his muscles, and burning like crazy. In regular times, Rodney would have already healed himself. After all, his energy consumption was relatively minimal when it came to himself, so he could easily use it to fix himself. He only had to imagine himself whole to make that a reality. Yet, Rodney held back on that skill due to the worst offender when it came to his mental state, which was the detail he was worried about the most. Blood flowed out of Rodney's nostrils like an unending stream that vouched for the terrible state of his brain. His eyelids had also long since become heavy, threatening to close themselves for entire hours, or even forever. He had almost reached his limit, and that wasn't even the end. The mutagen worked like an infection, but for the mana. It was meant to be expelled on its own, and the duration of that process depended on a person's tolerance and ethereal metabolism. George was stronger than Rodney, but his attacks hardly used any mana. His sharpness had to be maintained, not constantly summoned. After doing that, George's mana consumption plummeted, demanding no refilling from his mana core. Rodney was the complete opposite. He had abilities that didn't waste much mana. Still, they were obviously ineffective against his powerful opponent, forcing him to rely on better but more mana-heavy spells to fight on a somewhat even field. The miracles were far worse than those mana-heavy spells, almost existing in their own separate category. Their mana consumption was immense, forcing Rodney to refill his reserves constantly. As more new mana circulated through Rodney, the mutagen's effects thinned. The effort cleansed him of that infection far faster than what George was experiencing, almost reverting his enhanced state already. Rodney had a second syringe, which was somehow still on him despite the damage his trousers had suffered. However, the mutagen remained an experimental product with both significant and unclear possible side effects. Even the known, confirmed ones were fearsome enough to keep most warriors away. One of those side effects involved the nature of the mutations. After all, the mutagen's effects were profound, and its abuse could make those temporary changes permanent. The universe seemed to be mocking Rodney. It almost sounded like his only way to continue fighting was to risk turning into something inhuman. After all his bragging about humankind, that outcome would be sort of a karmic punishment. Yet, that would be pointless, too. Prolonging Rodney's mutated state, or even turning it into his new normality, wouldn't achieve anything. He would still be beyond exhausted, injured, and with no hope of winning that battle. The leaner alien's stance was more than enough to prove that last part. He was unharmed, with tall tongues of black, bright smoke flickering from his head, shoulders, and back. 10 gaseous, worm-like figures also hovered above the alien-evolved warriors, coiling their long, dense bodies in the air while keeping their big, elliptical mouths pointed at Rodney. Despite the multiple exchanges, the leaner alien didn't look any weaker. Rodney had guessed from the video with the 2 scouts that the denser smoke was a finite resource, but he didn't seem to have affected its reserves in any meaningful way. The only real silver lining in those losing exchanges involved details about the alien's abilities. He indeed mostly relied on those worm-like creatures to fight and could give birth to them rather freely. However, the first gaseous worm always acted as the center of the alien's offensive. Moreover, its smoke was denser than that of the other fuming creatures, as well as the intensity of its effect. The worm-like creatures only had one purpose. They devoured matter, air, and energy, adding it to their structure. That was one of the reasons behind the alien's still perfect state, and Rodney had also learned that those elliptical mouths were just for show. Any inch of those gaseous shapes carried those more intense annihilating effects. The other 9 worms were weaker than their leader, but Rodney couldn't do much with that information since they could still hurt him easily. The battle's outcome looked set in stone, and Rodney didn't try to defy it. Even with his miracles, he knew he couldn't win. Things might have been different against an opponent with no self-sustaining abilities, but cursing his bad luck wasn't in his style. Of course, that didn't mean Rodney would despair. He simply couldn't anymore. He had been there and had worked his entire life not to be that kind of hopeless man again, inspired by an iconic scene he still recalled after so many years. Rodney still vividly remembered the time he and the alien lover fell. They had been heading toward the deaths back then. Any ordinary warrior would have died in that situation. Rodney would have, too, but Khan had ended up showing him a different path. Khan was no man. He wasn't human, either. He was a traitorous entity that had turned his back on humankind. However, Khan was also unfathomably incredible. He had been like that even when he still lacked any alien advantage or political position. No matter the situation, that annoying alien lover didn't despair. He faced his predicaments fearlessly, only focusing on what he could do to overcome them, no matter how crazy those plans sounded. Rodney did exactly that now. He was exhausted both physically and mentally. The sole reason behind his ability to wield mana in that situation was expiring, and his opponent had no real stamina limit. Yet, Rodney didn't despair. Machinations kept happening in his mind until an obvious plan took form. Chapter 14:10, Deception. It was quite the no-brainer. As long as someone didn't fixate on pride, glory, or other superficial stuff, victory was indeed achievable, at least a partial version of it. Luckily, Rodney had none of those pointless feelings hindering his reasoning. He had made a point not to develop any. After all, humankind didn't need an ego-driven leader. It required someone who could look at the big picture, even accepting working in the shadows and dirtying his own hands to drive it forward. Rodney couldn't win, so he wouldn't. Yet, humankind could still achieve victory, so he would work toward that goal, doing his best not to die or lose too much of himself in the process. The problem before Rodney was three-faced now. First, Rodney couldn't give away his new strategy. The long-haired alien couldn't notice it. The plan would fail otherwise. Second, the new strategy didn't change Rodney's state. He was exhausted, only having enough fuel to perform 1 or 2 more miracles. Rodney needed at least 1 miracle to complete his plan, meaning he couldn't waste those powerful spells to survive the following exchanges. Third, the timing wasn't for Rodney to decide. It depended on the alien lover's best fan and his bald opponent fighting on the other side of that melted, broken battlefield. To make matters worse, Rodney had to use at least 1 miracle against the long-haired alien to avoid arousing suspicion. In theory, that spell had no real counters, but Rodney couldn't leave anything to chance. Moreover, the alien lover's fan and his opponent were constantly moving at a speed Rodney could barely follow. He had to time himself with their exchanges while dealing with the attacks flying at him, making everything more challenging. For all intents and purposes, Rodney was the wrong man to pull off that nigh impossible plan. Yet, Humankind didn't have anyone else. He wouldn't have had to be in a rush to lead it otherwise, so he had to do. Luckily, Rodney had one advantage there. His opponent had turned out to be rather talkative. "I won't last long," Rodney announced, using the Nax way of speaking. "In a few exchanges, we'll see if I can properly envision your death or will die in the process." "Son of the Mana," the long-haired alien called, almost sounding disappointed. "Your desperation is showing if you are resorting to words." 9 of the 10 worm-like creatures shot forward, enlarging or shrinking to surround Rodney from different directions and deploy a nigh unreadable offensive. Meanwhile, the 10th, denser, and more dangerous worm-like creature remained behind, hovering above the long-haired evolved warrior, seemingly watching the offensive unfold. Rodney held back a curse since he recognized that attack pattern. Still, he could only play by its rules once more, doing his best to steer it in an intended direction that would inflict as little damage as possible. A series of ringing noises resounded both inside and outside Rodney's mind, applying effects to his body and the black smoke. The worm-like creature's true chaos was something Rodney had already learned to effect, and his mastery over that process had only improved throughout the battle. Yet, the long-haired alien had also made adjustments to his creature's composition, starting a game of corrections against Rodney. So, despite all the improvements, the 9 worm-like creatures only flickered for a second, threatening to lose their structural integrity before restoring it and resuming their advance. Nevertheless, Rodney made full use of that second. His body almost moved on its own, propelled by internal and external forces that pushed it past its physical limits to follow planned gestures and evasive maneuvers. Rodney danced at a tune of his own through the 9 converging creatures, narrowly dodging each one of them, only leaving them his already torn military uniform as food. Still, Rodney knew that was the easy part. After dodging the 9 gaseous creatures, the denser leader appeared on his escape path, its vast, fuming mouth already closing on his right shoulder. The stars and uniform on Rodney's right shoulder instantly vanished, devoured by that intense, invasive energy inside the fuming mouth. His skin there was even following the same trend, wounds opening as pieces of it directly disappeared. The fuming mouth was about to devour Rodney's shoulder hole, but a donging noise resounded in his mind, and reality bent. His figure stopped existing in that location, instantly appearing before the long-haired alien while pointing his right elbow at his face. Rodney's elbow was already on the alien's nose, but the latter somehow remained faster than the completed attack. Smoke came out of the evolved warrior's mouth, creating a gaseous extension of it, threatening to devour Rodney's entire right limb. That development wasn't new for Rodney. He had already witnessed similar iterations of that and had even planned an escape route. His momentum suddenly vanished, and his figure flew sideways, exposing itself to the 10 worm-like creatures that had begun to chase after him. Rodney had initially planned another escape route for that predictable follow-up, but his brain felt on the verge of blacking out. The last miracle had almost drained him completely, temporarily preventing him from using any spells, forcing him to accelerate his plans. "The mana has a new god," Rodney exclaimed, hiding any positive reaction when the 10 gaseous creatures stopped their advance. "You can't comprehend what a god is," the leaner alien exclaimed through his strange way of speaking. "Maybe," Rodney admitted, "but he has already killed 2 scouts of the true chaos. I bet he is also hurrying here, bringing all his annoying alien awesomeness." "He shall find nothing but true chaos," the long-haired evolved warrior said, still holding back on continuing his assault to gather more information. "That wouldn't go well with him," Rodney explained. "He is quite the emotional, ungrateful leader. Well, not mine. Half of what I'm saying is just to wait until his biggest fan over there gets close enough." The long-haired alien didn't understand that line. Rodney had even stopped using the Nax language midway, making his statement even more confusing. Reality bent again, and Rodney began existing elsewhere. The long-haired alien initially checked his surroundings, expecting an attack, only to find his opponent in the middle of the other fight, delaying the blade that was about to kill the silver swordsman, watching as he cut through his companion. Chapter 14:11, Hero. George subconsciously noticed Rodney's state but couldn't focus on or mind it now. He only knew a miracle had happened. Rodney had delayed his certain death by a fraction of a second, which was enough to change that terrible fate. The bald alien's scaled, metallic skin had achieved something similar, halting George's momentum for an instant to create an opportunity for an unavoidable counterattack. Now that the tables had turned, George instantly used his brief, additional time to adjust his sharpness to that sudden defensive technique. His silver blade finally pierced the evolved warrior's temple, going far further than that. The silver blade split the alien's bald head diagonally, cutting through his neck and continuing to cleave through the right side of his chest, eventually coming out of his side. The gesture was swift, unhindered, and deadly. It also cut more than matter. George's sharpness reached as far as the evolved warrior's existence and true chaos, cleaving him on several levels. The whistling noise ended once George completed his slash, and silence ensued. The bald alien, Rodney, the long-haired alien in the distance, George himself, and the very world seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the inevitable flow of time to confirm that the impossible had happened. Slowly but surely, time kept flowing, albeit only for the bald alien. A blacker, diagonal line appeared on the evolved warrior's head, neck, and torso, releasing trails of dark blood that started flowing down his body. Strangely enough, the glowing black smoke on the alien's figure stopped flickering. Meanwhile, a chunk of his upper body started to slide sideways, dragging more than half of his head, half of his neck, and a fraction of his chest with it, including his right shoulder and the muscular arm attached to it. A thudding noise followed. The gory body part crashed onto the melted street while that muscular, maimed body remained straight, standing still. Even the torn black cape behind the alien was motionless, but that quiet was short-lived. The smoke on the back of the alien's figure suddenly regained life, its fabric trembling before the entirety of that energy blew outward. Rodney vaguely saw that event but was in no condition to dodge it. It was a miracle he was still aware and awake at all. Meanwhile, the many superficial cuts on George's body didn't hinder his movement at all, but the gales of true chaos remained faster. He could try to cut through them, but his arms didn't move. That lack of reaction immediately showed its reasons. George's subconscious didn't trigger warning signals because there was nothing to fear. That explosion of true chaos was nothing more than a harmless cluster of dispersing dense gales. The true chaos blew outward, covering the area and flickering for a few seconds before losing its structural integrity. That fearsome, troublesome energy dispersed into the world, leaving no trace of its insidious properties. George and Rodney quickly inspected their surroundings, only for the maimed body to lose its balance and tilt backward, retracting their attention. That severed corpse crashed on the metal surface, joining detached upper parts, ultimately confirming the two human warriors' achievement. Two fifth-level warriors had defeated an evolved being wielding an energy that counted the mana. The event was inconsequential in the grand scheme of things, but George and Rodney could very well consider it the apex of their military careers. Yet, Rodney couldn't be too ecstatic. The other Scarlet Eyes warrior was still there, as well as his king. That small victory didn't change Aina's predicament, and he was too exhausted to be of any use anymore. The mental exhaustion and injuries got the better of Rodney at that point. His vision darkened as his maimed hand released the black blade he had stopped, making it fall to the ground, which he planned to follow. Still, Rodney never fell. As his figure was about to hit the metal street, something grabbed his left, intact shoulder, slowly lowering him down until he could comfortably kneel on the ground. Rodney lifted his closing eyes, looking at the stern, strangely pensive face above him through his changing vision. The blue and green shades were receding, as well as his thermal vision, adding annoying details to that expression. George looked down at Rodney while still holding his shoulder. He saw his brown irises flattening, gradually going back to being human eyes. Even the wrinkle-like blood vessels on Rodney were fading, but his injured state quickly claimed his attention. Despite the bleeding leg, shoulder, and abdomen and the mangled hand, Rodney had still come to George's aid, effectively saving his life and giving him hope to return to the family he already longed so much for. Rodney's annoyance intensified as he noticed George's expression growing softer and more concerned. He knew the alien lover's biggest fan was getting the wrong idea, which it was better to correct before his force turned him into some hero. Nevertheless, when Rodney tried to speak, only coughs came out, splashing all the blood falling from his nostrils forward. George almost felt the urge to crouch down and help him, but his stance remained straight. It had to since the battle wasn't over. George glanced to his right while Rodney was busy stabilizing himself on the street, doing his best not to faint due to the fit that had captured his lungs. The long-haired alien didn't use that opportunity to launch an attack at the two men. Some shock actually tainted his expressionless face. George wouldn't bet on the fact that he could use that feint shock to his advantage. He didn't know how long it would take for reinforcements to arrive. Still, he clearly was the only able-bodied warrior left on the human side, so that long-haired alien was his to fight. George steadied his grip on the silver blade, taking a deep breath to fill his sharpness with all the power he had left. He could still fight. He could still come out alive from that situation, but his reptilian vision suddenly showed something odd. The event had been too fast, only manifesting itself as a sense that something was off. George even frowned in confusion until he realized that there was another heat signature next to the evolved warrior, shining so brightly he almost failed to spot the two horns on its forehead. Chapter 14:12, King. Everything had happened so suddenly that George struggled to make sense of the event for a whole second. It was rather impossible that such a strong entity could have sneaked up on his perception, appearing mere meters from him without making waves in the symphony, but that was the undeniable truth. The king had nonchalantly descended upon the battlefield, leaving his throne of smoke and the cloud's main body to stand at his warrior's side. After noticing that blinding, scorching presence, George couldn't miss it anymore. Actually, his entire vision focused on it, becoming its center and filling it. George became unable to see anything else, and his grip on his sword and Rodney's shoulder tensed, seemingly warning him about that terrible development. Luckily, the king seemed to have no interest in the two human warriors. His calm, emotionless demeanor almost tried to make him appear as a harmless addition to the battlefield, but neither George nor the long-haired alien dared to take him lightly. Their very instincts prevented them from doing that. The king was slightly shorter and more unassuming than both his underlings. Except for the second horn on his forehead, short black hair, and already scarlet eyes, he had no striking features to speak of. Still, small tongues of true chaos rose from the king's cape, flickering in the air, radiating his vast presence. They were actively releasing their insidious energy into the world, but more refilled them, acting as a constant infection that automatically took over their surroundings. Actually, that was more than a simple invasion. That denser, brighter, and impenetrable true chaos replaced the symphony, annihilating it while filling those holes with echoes of itself. That wasn't a conscious action. The king wasn't doing it on purpose. He was an existence opposite and superior to the mana, so much stronger than a whole world that his mere passage left permanent scars on it. George had seen similar effects whenever Khan was around technology or his emotions went out of control. However, the Scarlet-Eyes King looked stronger and subtler, like an unavoidable, inexorable, and unstoppable influence that bent the planet to his will. There was another worrying detail to the scene, too, one that George noticed only after he managed to divert his attention from that blinding presence. The king's sudden appearance had shocked George, but the long-haired alien shared that reaction. His now scarlet eyes were wide as he lowered his head at his leader, not daring to look straight at him. As strange as it sounded, the long-haired alien appeared more scared than George, making him tense up even further. George might lack the perception level necessary to comprehend the king's existence, but that odd reaction spoke louder than 1,000 words. The king seemed more interested in the wide streets and distant blocks than in the battlefield. Yet, its state eventually claimed his attention. He glanced at his dead underling's severed body, lingering in its inspection for a few seconds, before moving his emotionless gaze to his companion. The long-haired alien shuddered under that rather vague but impossibly heavy gaze, lowering his head even more. The true chaos flickering over his figure also shrank back inside his body, and the 10 worm-like creatures hovering above him followed the same trend. George had already guessed that the bloated-backed monsters and the Scarlet Eyes warriors only borrowed the true chaos' real shape, and that scene added clues to that idea. After all, that retraction didn't look natural. It wasn't the long-haired warrior's doing. The true chaos that overflew through him was now before its actual leader, so it abided by his silent bidding. George held his breath, realizing that his sharp existence displayed a similar reaction. Everything he had experienced during his first inspection of the king was there in a far stronger version, but something deeply concerning joined it. George couldn't help but feel small before the king. At an instinctive level, he understood that he was inferior. He was standing before something far greater than him, unavoidably triggering profound awe. That instinctive reaction more than vouched for how outclassed George was, but his partial ignorance was a bliss there. His inability to comprehend the king's power allowed him to remain straight and ready to battle. His weakness prevented him from panicking, but made him nothing more than an ant too stupid to understand his place in the food chain. That truth was also why the alien king never threw a single glance at George and Rodney. Only his still-alive warrior was worthy of his attention, albeit barely, and just to admonish punishment for his failure. Something changed in the long-haired alien's energy. He lifted his head, pointing his pleading, ashamed gaze at the king, but to no avail. The long-haired alien's true chaos raged, pushing from inside his body, bloating it. His figure twisted, expanding oddly, gaining disgusting features similar to the two-headed creatures leading the Black Smoke's charge, until his flesh's structural integrity gave in. The evolved warrior who had almost killed Rodney exploded, unleashing all the energy he possessed, releasing glowing black rivers on the spot. The event looked similar to what the bald alien had displayed after his death. Except that George found nothing harmless in it. The rivers had no precise targets. They expanded everywhere as if a whole sea had appeared in that small location and was now planning to occupy as much space as possible. Some of those raging waves headed for George's position, ready to overwhelm, submerge, and annihilate him. His very existence understood that nothing would be left of him if he let that true chaos wash over him, so his blade moved, guided by his subconscious. George instinctively let go of Rodney, his figure shining with an ominous dark silver light as he wielded his sword with two hands and pointed it forward. He didn't dare to perform any slashes since he knew they would be pointless. George only stood in his place, transforming into a sharp boulder, planning to split the tide. In less than a second, the glowing black tide was upon George, splitting at the clash with his existence. Raging smoke flowed at his sides and above, but his location remained relatively safe, surviving inside those waves. Nevertheless, the event was short-lived. George was nothing more than a pebble trying to alter a sea's course. His sharpness receded, devoured by the black wave's influence. He used that pressure to purify his existence, planning to achieve a superior state once more, only for a crack to appear on his silver sword. The trusty blade that had cleaved through an evolved warrior broke, splitting into shards that the now unhindered tide devoured. Those gaseous waves headed for George next, erasing his presence through their mere vicinity. Chapter 14:13, Woman. That wasn't the first instance of black waves washing over Heir. However, the new sea unleashed by the long-haired evolved warrior was incomparable, mostly since it didn't come from his power. The new waves didn't just flow into the streets. They crashed into the buildings, eating through them, annihilating their metal surfaces and making them crumble to the ground. Clearly, the tide of black smoke carried more than mere opposition to the mana. It was a proper spell fueled by true chaos, the same energy that gave life to the long-haired evolved warrior. The nukes had melted and burned a quarter of the city. The previous pillars of smoke had washed over more than a third of it. Still, the new sea directly pierced through block after block, seemingly wanting to expand until no trace of human presence was left in Heir. Half of Heir vanished, replaced by the Black Sea. Another quarter of it still had those gaseous waters, but they were shallower, allowing pieces of crumbled buildings and other debris to float over their surface. The area with the ongoing evacuation effort was the only zone spared by those black, gaseous waters, but the latter seemed ready to reach it next. The soldiers and citizens there couldn't even do much against the advancing waters since their technology wasn't working. The city's defensive walls had turned into a cage, trapping the people who had failed to escape in time and those who had come to their aid. The end looked nigh and unavoidable. Still, the sea stopped expanding before reaching those inhabited areas, albeit not for lack of gaseous matter or power. The black waves retreated, dragging metal surfaces, streets, crumbled buildings, and debris back to their source, exposing the barren, white sand under the city. A desert expanded right in the middle of Heir, revealing the figures still standing on it. The sea converged toward the Scarlet Eyes King, disappearing inside his body as if he were a bottomless tank of true chaos. All the city's metal debris suffered from the same fate, absorbed by the black hole that was that two-horned evolved warrior. The long-haired alien and his companion's corpse had also disappeared, dragged back by the waves, but other black figures had remained straight on the now deserted area. Several two-headed, four-armed, bloated-backed creatures stood near the desert's edge, where the white sand and the surviving city blocks met. Trails of smoke leaked from their hideous physical feature, but they were too thin to bring any meaningful change to the now clear environment. The sea only seemed to have spared the members of the Scarlet Eyes army, but an exception existed on the White Desert, on a spot near the sole remaining caped evolved warrior. A tall, female, and ethereal humanoid figure shone near the king, radiating a white, pure glow that matched the desert's color. That ethereal figure only featured the upper side of a woman crouched down into a protective embrace. Still, black cracks covered her bright surfaces, which expanded to reveal her insides. Two men became visible as the spell started to dissolve. George was on his feet, the broken sword still in his hands. His dark silver aura had disappeared, and the same went for the reptilian features caused by the mutagen. George's reversal to his regular state left him defenseless against the nearby true chaos-annihilating presence. His energy reserves instantly vanished, and the mana inside his flesh came next, filling him with a deep sense of exhaustion and overall weakness. Nevertheless, George couldn't focus on his state. He didn't even care for the king's breathtaking presence mere meters from him. His now regular eyes were on the man right in front of him, who had saved him once again. Rodney stood before George, his arms crossed in front of his face to act as a shield for both of them. The already torn military uniform had pretty much disappeared, leaving only a piece of cloth on his left shoulder and something to hide his private parts. That half-naked state obviously couldn't claim George's attention. His eyes slid down that muscular back to focus on Rodney's exposed and bleeding right leg, which featured a syringe still stabbed into his thigh. Somehow, Rodney had pulled off another miracle, relying on a second dose of the mutagen to obtain the energy to protect both George and himself. George was at a loss for words. He didn't even think, but his eyes briefly rose toward the disappearing glowing spell. The ethereal woman's face had begun to fade, too, but George felt able to spot vague similarities with Monica's facial features. However, Rodney tilted backward, snapping George out of his inspection and daze. The former was about to crash limply on the surviving chunk of metal street under the two men when George caught him, carefully laying him down. The side effects of the mutagen's second dose became evident at that point. Rodney's half-closed eyes featured reptilian pupils again, but the blood vessels on his face had reappeared and multiplied, stretching past his chin, covering his neck to reach for his shoulders. The blood vessels pulsated, seemingly heading toward the critical point of their structural integrity, but George mainly focused on what they tried to depict. Their intricate patterns almost drew scales on Rodney's face and neck, slowly turning into permanent marks. George's speechlessness somehow deepened at that sight. Despite the bold claims and irritating character, George knew Rodney wasn't really xenophobic. Still, his loyalty and pride in humankind were undeniable. Nevertheless, that same man had accepted the possibility of permanent mutations to fend off the last attack, seemingly to protect George. Rodney's reptilian eyes remained half-closed but focused when a storm of worry and guilt filled George's expression. His bloodied lips parted, releasing whispers that forced George to lean down to listen to. "You are a more valuable asset, War," Rodney weakly said, attempting to justify his altruistic action, but failing at it when more whispers escaped his mouth. "And have more to lose." George didn't know whether to feel grateful or irked. Despite that terrible state, Rodney was still trying to be as difficult as always, but George couldn't argue with him there, especially since they weren't out of danger just yet. George glanced to his right, briefly inspecting his broken blade before looking past it. The alien king was still there, unassuming but unfathomably powerful. His scarlet gaze was also pointed in the two men's direction, but George soon realized the evolved warrior wasn't inspecting them. That scarlet gaze wasn't vague or uncaring anymore, either. It showed a tinge of interest, or an inferior version of that. George was about to frown at that confusing detail, but answers arrived before his perception could update him on the situation. "You did well to survive this long," a calm, confident voice resounded from behind George, accompanied by the sound of steady steps digging into the sand. "We'll take over now." A second set of steps joined the first, being far heavier, accompanied by rhythmical high-pitched squeaking and deep groans of bending metal. George lifted his gaze, only to see two men stopping at his sides, showing their familiar features. Colonel Norrit and Major General Arngen had arrived on Aina, wielding auras proper of evolved warriors and a pair of reptilian eyes each. Chapter 14:14, Fun. The citizens and soldiers in the relatively small intact piece of the city had gone through a rollercoaster of emotions. Aina's defensive wall had turned into a death trap during the advancing sea, but its absence wouldn't have helped much. After all, the environment outside the city was radioactive and toxic, requiring technology that didn't work anymore to cross it safely. When the sea retreated, the survivors amassed near the city wall and adjacent blocks heaved a sigh of relief. Yet, the bloated-backed monsters were still there, and they didn't just stand. Tinges of the weaker true chaos contained in the two-headed creature's bloated physical features never stopped escaping into the air. Still, their flow intensified until flickering pillars rose into the sky. The rivers reappeared, except they now flowed into the air instead of filling the streets, fusing high in the sky to recreate the cloud that the sea's withdrawal had removed. Moreover, the bloated-backed monsters soon resumed their advance, planning to fulfill their duty. Their faceless heads pointed forward, heading toward the remaining blocks and the people amassed behind them. Needless to say, the Relief-Anis citizens and their reinforcements had previously experienced vanished, paving the way for the return of mass panic and terror. Their predicament truly looked inescapable, but more managed to follow. To the crowd's surprise, a vast chunk of the defensive wall at some distance away blew outward, sending fuming debris toward the still intact blocks and white desert past them. The surviving metal surface of the city and the wall all around the explosion trembled, unleashing an earthquake that those still intact surfaces quickly suppressed. A torrent of grey smoke accompanied the short earthquake, blowing out of the cracked, bent, and melted tall cavity in the defensive wall. That gas joined the true chaos in the sky, seemingly wanting to challenge it, but obviously disappearing before it could even get close to the expanding black cloud. Nevertheless, no one in the crowd bothered to look at the sky. Everyone focused on the cavity's base since dark silhouettes moved through it, crossing the grey smoke to step into the city. The event initially intensified the mass panic, especially since the first silhouette that emerged from the smoke wasn't human. To make things worse, the second was even more inhuman, and that trend didn't stop at the others. A widespread alien invasion seemed to be in full force that day. However, a few individuals among the crowd eventually recognized something, connecting mental dots, triggering some surprising but no less intense hope. The surprising scene ended up quelling the mass panic. Brittle, hesitant calm spread as more soldiers and citizens realized what was happening. Reinforcements had indeed arrived. They simply waved the banner of the most infamous person on the network. That allegiance was evident for everyone to see. After all, the figures walking out of the cavity in the defensive wall belonged to 4 different species. The crowd saw Skalker, Thilku, Efi, and humans abiding by the same battle formation, and only one person in the entire universe could make that possible. Despite including 4 different species, the diverse team was rather small. It was nothing more than a big platoon, barely counting 50 heads. Some had rifles and other weapons, but they weren't exactly the kind and quantity of reinforcements Anis citizens hoped to see. Nevertheless, the reason for that small number of troops soon became evident, at least it did to those briefed on the Scarlet Eye's troublesome ability and the countermeasures the joint front had developed against that enemy. The troops occasionally glanced at the helpless crowd. They couldn't have been more diverse, but they all featured strange sets of reptilian eyes. That identical feature should have been impossible for such different species, but the truth was there for everyone to see. Of course, the troops couldn't care about the helpless citizens when the bloated-backed monsters were still advancing toward the intact pieces of the city. After a brief inspection, different war cries echoed from the platoon, which split into multiple teams to rush at the incoming alien threat. Meanwhile, in the middle of the desert inside the city, on the single surviving chunk of metal on the white sand, Colonel Mark Norrit and Major General Craig Ongan stood next to the kneeling George and lying Rodney, wary about the superior existence before them. Major General Ongan looked bigger than he had ever been and slightly younger. His stern face had lost its few wrinkles, and his short hair had grown darker, reflecting faint red shades under the glow of Earth's sun. The general's muscular, huge frame conveyed immense vitality and might, which was easy to study due to his shirtless state. He was only donning military trousers and boots, but all those details and changes paled compared to the striking item on his right limb. A dark, reddish, artificial metal arm stretched from the general's stump, seamlessly attached to his skin and acting as a natural part of his body. Except for the color and fabric, the artificial limb was no different than a regular arm. It had 5 fingers, a wrist, normal joints, and even shallow grooves to mark extensions of the general's muscles. The limb was perfectly identical to the intact left arm. Yet, the general opened and closed his right hand, seemingly wanting to familiarize himself with its sensations and waiting for the squeaking and groaning noises to stop. Major General Ongen only looked at the Scarlet-Eyes King, matching his unwavering interest toward the two newcomers. Meanwhile, Colonel Norrit allowed himself to divert his reptilian gaze, studying George and Rodney's conditions. George was lightly wounded but otherwise fine. Instead, Rodney was far worse off, looking drained beyond reason and also suffering from the mutagen's side effect. Colonel Norrit kept his inspection short since a few seconds were more than enough to assess the situation. He couldn't do much and wasn't even sure anyone could. Still, he felt glad he had prepared for that eventuality. A medical team is underway, Colonel Norrit announced, moving his reptilian, brown eyes to the Scarlet-Eyes King. We'll push the battle away in the meantime, right, General? You take care of that stuff, Mark, Major General Ongen exclaimed, not hiding his boiling excitement. I just want to go wild until the cocky brat arrives and spoils the fun. Chapter 14-15, Number. George belonged to Khan's inner circle, so he was privy to Major General Ongen's character and situation. The man didn't gain the title of Demon of 1,000 Wars by chance, and regaining access to the battlefield had made the personality traits aligned with it resurface. Yet, George also knew that the general's evolution had been recent, having occurred barely a few months ago. That usually wasn't nearly enough of a period to get used to that new, superior state, let alone stabilize and improve it to face a Scarlet-Eyes King. Still, Major General Ongen had been in a unique situation. Unlike most 5th-level warriors, he had been more than ready to face the evolution. His missing arm had held him back, but he had been mentally, physically, and spiritually prepared for the event for years or longer. Moreover, the general wielded a peculiar element. In many ways, he was more unique than Khan, and all that accumulated potential was unleashed now that the Fuvil had given him an arm that could unlock his evolution. Major General Ongen wasn't even alone. He would face the Scarlet-Eyes King with Colonel Norrit, who more than compensated for his character flaws. Truth be told, George didn't believe that numerical advantage would achieve much, but reassurance spread inside him anyway, which didn't only come from the welcome sight of reinforcements. Just hearing confirmation that Khan was coming was enough to get rid of all of George's worries. He knew that everything would be over once Khan stepped on Earth. George believed that without a shadow of a doubt. Besides, George was also done with the whole invasion. He had fought and fought well. He couldn't have played his part in that war better, so he was out now, wanting nothing more than to return to his family. Well, Colonel, Major General, George called, fighting away his physical weakness to get back to his feet. With your permission. Patriarch Ildu, Colonel Norrit politely replied, wanting to nod but remaining still to continue inspecting the caped evolved warrior in front of him. Patriarch, Major General Ongen uttered, limiting himself to that word while imitating the colonel. Rodney was fighting to remain awake. His consciousness was trapped between the awareness enforced by the mutagen's power and the unawareness his exhausted brain tried to establish, leaving him in quite the confused state. Nevertheless, Rodney captured a few key details that allowed him to make sense of the situation. Balway's evolved warriors had arrived, and reinforcements had most likely followed them. It was all about watching the battle unfold to gather additional data to prepare for the following fights now. Still, Rodney suddenly experienced a pulling force from the intact piece of cloth on his shoulder, which dragged him away from the chunk of metal and into the white sand. I must, Rodney weakly complained when he realized what was happening. Watch. Human. Representative. Necessary. Shut up, Rodney, George snorted, continuing to pull Rodney away through the desert, his body immune to the sand's radioactive properties despite his temporary lack of mana. The only must we have is for doctors and drinks, maybe even getting laid. George diverted his gaze in thought when he considered that last point, inevitably realizing something troublesome. Maybe avoid that last part for now, George added. Let's make sure Khan is on board before you try to hit that. Miss Solidary doesn't need anyone's approval to date again, Rodney argued, somehow speaking more steadily when it came to that topic, but getting tired right afterward. And, aren't friends, Patriarch. You sure like to be difficult, George sighed, lowering his voice, wanting to complain a bit more but eventually opting to hold back. Obviously, George was keeping track of the increasingly distant Scarlet-Eyes King. Still, the alien evolved warrior seemed to have no interest in his retreat, giving him the chance to focus on something else. Past grudges and complicated relationships aside, George couldn't forget how Rodney had saved his life twice. He also couldn't ignore what he had seen during Rodney's last defensive spell and the price he had paid to cast it. Against all odds, Rodney truly seemed to be serious about Monica, putting George in quite the pickle. He honestly didn't know how to navigate the situation between Khan, his wife, Monica herself, and the debt toward Rodney. To make things worse, the situation became even more complicated. George was heading for Aina's intact blocks, holding back on his speed due to Rodney's injuries, but still advancing at a decent pace through the desert. That eventually put the battles happening in the distance in George's sight. The soldiers who had accompanied Colonel Norrit and Major General Ongan had started to fight the bloated-backed creatures, seemingly managing to push them back. Those apparent victories paved the path for additional reinforcements. Saving what was left of Aina was indeed a goal, but rescuing the surviving citizens stood above that, demanding vehicles to evacuate everyone through the desert safely. Still, one of those vehicles advanced further than the defensive wall, crossing the battles with the bloated-backed creatures to dive into the desert inside the city, heading for Rodney and George as soon as it spotted them. George lay Rodney down at the sight of that military, reinforced jeep. He lifted the arm still wielding the broken sword, waving at it to continue claiming its attention. Yet, when the vehicle stopped a few meters from him, it released the last person he had ever expected to see on the battlefield. Why do all the men I know have a thing for getting beaten to death? A familiar voice escaped the jeep's insides before a woman George couldn't help but recognize stepped on the white sand. Monica had somehow gotten to Aina, accompanied by a medical team that immediately addressed George and Rodney's injured state. "Miss Solidary," Rodney called, managing to react faster than George at that surprising sight, even pretending to be better than he was. "The battlefield isn't a place worthy of your status." "I go wherever I please, General Semmet," Monica snorted, watching as the medical team handled both men. "And how can you talk after standing me out to a lunch you begged me for weeks to partake in?" Monica's attire matched her words. Despite being on an active battlefield, she was wearing a golden dress only suitable for fancy places. It seemed she didn't waste time changing to rush to Aina as soon as possible. "I apologize, Miss Solidary," Rodney exclaimed, holding back a cough as the doctors moved him around and checked his reptilian eyes through analog tools. "Duty called." Monica was about to complain again, but something in George's expression made her look at him, earning her a silent and approving nod. "What's his condition?" Monica eventually sighed, giving up on the previous issue. "The injuries are manageable, Miss Solidary," one of the doctors kneeling toward Rodney explained, "but the mutagen seems to have taken root. We don't know how to revert his state yet, or if it's possible at all." Those troublesome side effects were known to Monica, but her eyes still widened in surprise. Her lips also parted in what appeared to be worry, dropping any facade of annoyance to look down at Rodney. "I thought you'd have liked me more if I became more alien," Rodney reassured, mustering a smirk that almost seemed aimed at mocking Monica. "That's your type, isn't it?" "I never liked you," Monica scoffed, crossing her arms, but failing to refrain herself from adding another word. "Idiot." George blinked. He felt he had seen a version of similar interactions years ago, but something greater happened before his mind could process those clues. A pillar of dark red light appeared in the distance, shining where George had come from, rising into the sky to illuminate its surroundings. The battle between those evolved warriors seemed about to start, and George knew he had to get out of there. "Can they do it?" Monica asked at the sight of the dark red pillar, going through thoughts similar to George's. "Can they win?" George wasn't an evolved warrior, but Monica trusted his judgment, which forced him to voice a terrible truth. "No." Chapter 14:16, Demon. Back on the small chunk of street in the middle of the desert inside the city, Colonel Norrit and Major General Ongan remained in their position, facing the calm and unbothered Scarlet-Eyes King. Of course, George's swift retreat had spread some tension in the area, but the two human soldiers relaxed when they realized that their opponent had no interest in their weaker allies. Still, as welcome as the event was, that didn't promise anything good. The king's seemingly careless and slightly intrigued stance even deepened that feeling. Unfounded arrogance could be at play there, but neither Colonel Norrit nor Major General Ongan was inclined to believe that. All things considered, both men were new evolved warriors. They only had one fight against a similar existence under their belts, and that was when they were still in the 5th level. That first actual fight would even feature an existence that stood several levels above ordinary evolved warriors. The Scarlet Eyes King couldn't possibly be weak, and that was quite easy to confirm. Despite the mutagen and the matching evolved status, Colonel Norrit couldn't see through the two-horned alien at all. That vast, profound, and thick existence was simply impenetrable, vouching for how outclassed he was in that superior realm. Still, Colonel Norrit had never bet on himself when it came to enemy profiling. Balway only had the time to replicate small quantities of the experimental fuel General Semmet had sent to the planet, so technology was also limited there, but Major General Ongen wasn't. The general was a peculiar existence. His element gave him access to an energy only he could sense and wield, adding a unique sixth sense to his ordinary perception. Despite sharing the colonel's issues, Major General Ongen wasn't completely blind to the king's existence. He could somewhat see and gauge it, but that didn't do him any good. The general's initial statement had considered that exact point. The true nature of the situation had been clear to him at the mere smell of the king's bloodlust. Even if he and the colonel had joined that battle after gaining more experience, the result wouldn't have changed. Of course, Colonel Norrit had instantly understood the meaning behind Major General Ongen's statement, but had also hoped for a silver lining. Yet, the general didn't add anything, reaffirming his previous evaluation. "How much of your charge do you want to use, General?" Colonel Norrit asked. "I don't think I have much of a choice," Major General Ongen commented. "All of it? What if you go completely wild?" Colonel Norrit wondered. "Same protocol as always," Major General Ongen exclaimed. "Just put me down." "I'm not sure the little shit would agree," Colonel Norrit pointed out. "Our leader is quite caring." "Then, he'd better hurry down here," Major General Ongen snickered. "But not until I've had my fun." The conversation ended there since Major General Ongen crossed his arms and lowered his head behind them, setting his existence aflame. Dark red light surrounded his figure and brightened, eventually rising past him to head for the sky. A pillar of ominous light took form, and Major General Ongen transformed inside it. His nails stretched, becoming dark claws. His skin reddened, gaining a metallic luster. That color also invaded his sclera, and more followed. Somehow, the artificial arm transformed with Major General Ongen, changing far more than the previous prototypes ever did. Its color lightened to match his skin's, and its fingers stretched, gaining pointy tips that imitated the sharp nails on his left hand. Major General Ongen exhaled slowly as the transformation stabilized, his voice becoming a deep growl that seeped past his now sharper teeth. Curved, black horns had also grown from the sides of his forehead, being far bigger than what the king donned. The horns kept growing as the general lowered his crossed arms. The dark red pillar also receded, fusing with him to deepen his transformation. Soon, Major General Ongen looked nothing like a human. Only the word, demon, could describe his existence. Once the transformation ended, Major General Ongen straightened himself and threw his head backward, releasing a monstrous battle cry. A broad grin had appeared on his face by the time he lowered it, but pointing it at the Scarlet Eyes King marked the end of the pleasantries. Major General Ongen shot forward, being far faster than a man of his size should ever be, lowering his head to point his curved horns at the king. That was nothing short of a bull's charge. Except Major General Ongen was stronger than any animal, and the sand split open as his advancing figure built momentum. Nevertheless, the king didn't move. He tilted his head in curiosity before Major General Ongen's horns slammed on his head, inflicting no damage at all. The sand at the crash zone's sides blew away, falling prey to violent gales, but the king remained utterly still, and the same went for the desert behind him. The alien didn't falter at all before that violent charge, protecting the other areas in the attack's path in the process. Major General Ongen was far nimbler than his huge body would make people believe. His head snapped up, accompanied by his arms, which almost immediately delivered two joint uppercuts at the king's chin. A roar cut through the area, sending more sand flying, clearing the desert under the general's feet, only for more of that white surface to appear. His physical strength was terrifying, but the king remained still and unaffected once again. Major General Ongen's grin only broadened at that sight. A dark red halo enveloped his figure, empowering his every function. He was ready to headbutt the alien, only to find himself lying in the desert, a torrent of white sand filling his vision. The event had been too sudden to allow any inspection. Major General Ongen could only understand that he was struggling to breathe while the sand fell back on him. His back also hurt, almost hiding the firm pressure on his neck. As the sand settled, the king became visible. He was standing before the lying general with one foot on his throat, ready to crush it, but delaying that attack to ask a question. "Does this planet have a king?" The scarlet-eyed king asked through a whisper that both the general and the colonel instantly translated. Chapter 14:17, Wild. Colonel Norrit had to admit the exchange shocked him. He had always known both he and Major General Ongen were outclassed, but the difference in power surpassed his worst estimates. The colonel could sort of accept that the general's charge had no effect. That outcome was still surprising, but evolved warriors wielded a wide range of strange abilities that resonated with their existence. Yet, what followed the one-sided clash left the colonel speechless. Despite temporarily staying away from the battle to gather information, he didn't see anything at all. To make things worse, Colonel Norrit felt somewhat sure the king hadn't relied on any special technique. He was simply so fast that the colonel couldn't even try to record the action. Major General Ongen was in a similar situation. His red, reptilian eyes stared up at the king in disbelief, but his grin remained broad. The energy only the general could see resonated with his very being. The king looked calm, but his bloodlust was palpable to Major General Ongen, and he could make use of it. The king stomped his foot, only for General Ongen's throat to endure the blow. The sand all around his lying figure blew away, but he remained in one piece. That would have been impossible with his soul energy, but the general had access to more than that. Major General Ongen's demonic features deepened as he slowly sat up, pushing the king's leg away. His muscles bulged, increasing his size, and his horns grew. The same went for his sharp teeth, which stretched past his lips to create 4 fangs. The king seemed to find the event interesting. He retracted his leg, and Major General Ongens promptly stood up, delivering a rising uppercut to the alien's chin again. This time, the blow sent the sand behind the king flying, vouching for its superior power, but the alien remained still once again. However, Major General Ongen didn't stop transforming, either. Black spikes grew from the general's back, piercing his metallic red skin, releasing some blood that flowed down his waist. Similar horn-like items rose from his spine as he slammed his shoulder on the alien's face. An earthquake spread through the desert as proper sandstorms tried to form, but the king didn't falter even once. He looked immune to the tremors, too, but his scarlet eyes moved away from the demonic titan to glance past him. All the sand that had risen into the air had tried to hide it, but the king couldn't possibly miss the event. His surroundings had started changing color due to an expanding yellow-green halo. Major General Ongen tried to distract the king from the event, growing even taller while joining his fists and hammering them down at his opponent. Nevertheless, the king let the massive blow land on his head, his scarlet irises reaching his eyes' leftmost corners to peek past his shoulder. The yellow-green halo had intensified in those seconds, becoming evident despite the additional sand in the air. A vague silhouette also formed behind the king, thrusting something sharp at his nape. The object made no sound when it hit the king's nape. It actually expanded on it due to its partially liquid texture, fusing with the alien's black hair and the skin underneath. Green smoke oozed out of that half-solid puddle as the silhouette grew clearer. Colonel Norrit had materialized behind the king, wielding a liquid sword that tried to infect the evolved warrior. Sadly, the attack seemed to have no effect. The king turned his head, the smoke on his back devouring the yellow-green puddle while he inspected Colonel Norrit. Major General Ongen exploited that opportunity to deliver a thrusting attack at the king's torso, planning to use his sharp nails and metal fingers to pierce that black robe. The impact against the robe sent a shockwave behind the king, who watched as Colonel Norrit's figure turned gaseous and fused with the yellow-green halo, seemingly disappearing. As for the actual attack, Major General Ongen failed to achieve anything. His nails and sharp metal fingers didn't even manage to tear through the black robe. Actually, one of the formers snapped in half due to the violent impact with that impenetrable surface. The king completely ignored Major General Ongen as he kept inspecting the halo. He lifted his gaze while arrow-like shapes formed among that yellow-green area, which immediately shot down to explode into thick, poisonous clouds. Dense green smoke surrounded the king, splitting into even denser tendrils that tried to enter the alien's nostrils and seep into his skin, ears, eyes, and paws. Nevertheless, nothing ever pierced the king, but Major General Ongen was already delivering his next attack. His broken nail had regrown, but he went for a wild bite at the alien's face. Two of the general's long fangs cracked and broke as he tried to bite off a chunk of the king's face. It seemed nothing could hurt that powerful alien, but Major General Ongen only grew more heated at that sight. A deep, hoarse laugh escaped Major General Ongen as more of his sharp teeth stretched further. His muscles bulged even more, forcing his bones to grow to make room for those additional tissues. The dark red halo around the general intensified, pushing aside the yellow-green cloud and its poisonous effects to immerse the area in something wilder and more violent. The event forced the king to refocus on his demonic opponent, albeit not due to sensing any danger. A reddish mist escaped the general's fanged mouth, accompanying his breath, before he delivered a quick succession of punches and thrusts. The speed achieved by the general's attacks was unfathomable and theoretically impossible for his size. Still, there he was, unleashing everything he had onto his opponent in under a second. Major General Ongen ended his succession of attacks with a joint palm strike. Sandstorms covered the entire area at that point, but a huge figure immediately left their range, sliding over the desert due to the momentum he had accumulated. Despite being the one launching attacks, Major General Ongen had ended up being flung away by his strength. Meanwhile, the sand in the air eventually settled, revealing the intact king who had yet to move from his spot or suffer any injury. "Mark, I might have been wrong," Major General Ongen announced at that sight, his voice resembling a monstrous growl. "I'll have to go wild just to hope to survive this one." Chapter 14:18, Diversity. Colonel Norrit had left his initial position to deliver his attack, but reappeared in the sky, his body condensing from a piece of the green cloud the general's attack had blown away. Despite the formerly gaseous shape, Colonel Norrit heard the general's statement and agreed with it. They both had yet to make the king budge, and getting serious might not change that. If anything, they were still alive only because that alien looked curious about their abilities. That curiosity was veiled but became more evident with each exchange. As Colonel Norrit reappeared in the sky, the king looked at him, only to point his scarlet eyes at the general again. That was due to Major General Ongen's ongoing transformation. He didn't get any bigger, not yet at least, but the spikes on his back grew and twisted. Also, his skin darkened even further, intensifying its metallic luster. Clearly, the general wasn't holding anything back anymore, ready to face the possible side effects of his element to increase his fighting chances against that alien opponent. Colonel Norrit had a more support-oriented role in that teamwork, but that didn't stop him from switching to higher gears. His skin paled, gaining a sickish, yellowish color, while his hair grew, his strands tips becoming green and starting to ooze poisonous smoke. Those transformations conveyed the two human warriors' evolved status more clearly. The air around the colonel twisted, making his figure unclear and gaining ominous green hues. Meanwhile, the dark red halo around Major General Ongen started to make the surrounding air and sand tremble on the spot, making their very fabric restless. Evolved warriors existed past their physical limits, and both human warriors embodied those features. Yet, the king didn't look too convinced about that display of superior power. Even his interest seemed to wane as his lips parted to release another whisper. "The sons of the mana wield broad diversity," the king announced. "That's the weapon the mana created in the hope of surpassing the true chaos." Colonel Norrit and Major General Ongen didn't interrupt the king. For once, they didn't know much about the topic, and any information would help. Also, they'd accept anything that bought them time. "But our God was already the answer," the king continued. "Your diversity is a failed experiment." The king looked up, eyeing Colonel Norrit, adding another statement. "You are no kings, and that being is no god." Neither Colonel Norrit nor Major General Ongen could speak the Nax language, so they didn't try to reply. Yet, they understood who the king had referred to. Clearly, the Scarlet Eyes were aware of Khan and his purpose. "You are no warriors, either," the king pointed out. "You are pretending to be, but your time is running short." That power classification was known to the two human warriors, but hearing it again did little to change the situation. After all, the king was right. The colonel and the general had no special art at the disposal that could match the true chaos. The mutagen was making them able to fight, but that wasn't amounting to much. Even so, Colonel Norrit voiced, not caring whether the king could understand him. "We will fight and struggle to our last breath." Colonel Norrit charged down, landing behind the king again. He planted his hand on the black cape, releasing no spell at all. Meanwhile, the trails of true chaos affected his body, invading his flesh in an attempt to devour it. That wasn't a planned action. It was merely the result of facing a superior energy without raising specific defenses. Still, Colonel Norrit wanted exactly that. He needed to be inflected. The king watched as true chaos spread through the colonel's arm before his figure became gaseous, vanishing and condensing again several meters away. Black smoke still flickered on his right limb, but he grabbed his forearm, squeezing it to stop and reverse that invasion. Colonel Norrit's efforts pushed the invading true chaos toward his palm, leaving injuries on his arm. Blood fell from those gory grooves, which landed on the white sand and released sizzling noises, alongside green wisps of poison. The injuries didn't hinder the process. The true chaos kept condensing on the colonel's right palm until a dark green flame came out of it. The king's interest intensified when that tongue of flame appeared, but another event forced him to turn. Something big and dark red had appeared before him, towering above his figure by more than a meter. Major General Ongen was hardly recognizable now. He was a burly mess of spikes, claws, horns, and fangs, being taller than the Skalker and releasing red mist with each of his ragged growls. The general had become an alien monster, his face carrying no trace of reason. His red, reptilian eyes were wide as they looked down at the king, seemingly ready to devour him. A series of shockwaves and roars followed. The monstrous general unleashed a flurry of punches, bites, thrusts, charges, and more in the span of a few seconds. The barrage of attacks was so intense and condensed that the sand failed to react to the shockwaves it caused. It only shook, accumulating momentum and slightly moving away from the points of impact. Soon, the king lost his foothold, ending up floating in the middle of a circular cavity, but that hardly changed anything. His figure remained unaffected by the barrage of demolishing attacks, not faltering at all. The assault was so worthless that the king ended up turning back to Colonel Norrit, who had manipulated the dark green flame, seemingly exhausting himself to stretch and alter it in the shape of an arrow. The struggle didn't end there. The dark green arrow seemed to want to escape Colonel Norrit's control, but he grabbed it with his injured arm and forcefully threw it at the king. As always, the king didn't move, but a different outcome finally unfolded. The arrow hit the alien right in the chest, piercing his robe and flesh, coming out from the other side, where Major General Ongen could grab it. Chapter 1419, Ineffective. Major General Ongen's element wasn't without drawbacks. The deeper he delved into his bloodlust, the more that urge took control of his thoughts and functions. The global army had done extensive tests on the general's element during his fighting days. That had given him an idea of his potential, abilities, and limits. He knew where the point of no return stood, but wasn't at liberty to consider it now. Truth be told, the king was too strong. His existence was so grand, vast, and profound that no attack could affect his physical features. Colonel Norrit and Major General Ongen couldn't hurt him with their power, so they relied on a different energy. Major General Ongen had harnessed the king's seemingly endless bloodlust to achieve his current transformation. Meanwhile, Colonel Norrit had let the king's true chaos infect and hurt him to create a poison that could wound that superior existence. Therefore, the dark green arrow pierced the king, and Major General Ongen promptly grabbed its sharp, half-liquid tip, guided by violent thoughts to wield the spell like a sword and slash it all over his opponent. The arrow seamlessly ran through the king's robe and flesh, as if it were a part of him. Major General Ongen met no resistance while slashing the dark green weapon multiple times, leaving narrow but long marks over the alien's figure. Colonel Norrit followed the exchange and adapted to it, eventually altering the arrow, making it expand into a dense, poisonous cloud that rested on the general's horns, fangs, knuckles, sharp metal fingers, and nails. Major General Ongen's main means of attack gained a dark green membrane that hurt him while also enabling him to pierce the king. He switched back to his previous offensive, resorting to his flurry of punches, thrusts, bites, and charges, and each of those blows inflicted some damage. The king's flesh and robe bent under the general's punches. The latter's thrusts and bites dug holes into the alien evolved warrior. His shoulder charges and headbutts left deep marks on that shorter figure, maiming it beyond recognition. Then, Colonel Norrit willed it, and the dark green membrane exploded into a torrent of poisonous gales that sent the general flying away before condensing into a thick cloud. The sand in the clouds surrounding sizzled and started releasing dark smoke under those poisonous effects. The area lost its white color, becoming darker and slimier. Mud-oozing gases that twisted the sunlight rose into the air, expanding the spell's range. Colonel Norrit had to land on the sand at some distance from the green cloud at that point. His sickish complexion had worsened, joined by some evident exhaustion. Controlling the poison tainted by the true chaos had taken a lot out of him, but the spell seemed to have worked. Meanwhile, Major General Ongen slammed on the desert, only to immediately jump back to his feet and charge ahead, growling monstrously. He dived at full speed into the cloud, lifting a storm of sand with his heavy steps. The cloud didn't exactly welcome the general. Its poisonous fumes attacked his metallic skin, attempting to reject him, but he dived inside anyway, solely driven by his bloodlust. The general's huge figure soon disappeared, but tremors followed, spreading through the muddy patch of the desert and the sand past it. The demonic titan had resumed unleashing his heavy attacks, and Colonel Norrit could only hope they had some effect while he worked overtime to make the poisonous cloud retain its structural integrity. The tremors were so heavy they resounded with Colonel Norrit's very existence. After all, his element had become more poison-oriented, and that spell relied on the core of his being to remain active. It wouldn't have had such effects otherwise, meaning he had to endure the blows partially. Nevertheless, something far stronger and impossible to stop suddenly expanded inside the cloud. Colonel Norrit only had the time to widen his eyes before wretches took control of his throat and mouth, making him puke mouthfuls of dark blood. The cloud exploded into countless dense wisps of poison that dispersed into the air, revealing a concerning scene. Major General Ongen was on his knees, kept down by the black hand around his throat. Meanwhile, the king had reappeared, showing no trace of the previous injuries. If anything, the faint interest his scarlet eyes radiated seemed to be gone now. The sons of Mana are disappointing, the king announced. Major General Ongen tried to growl despite the hand on his throat. Only a whisper seeped past his fangs, but his massive arms moved, too, delivering heavy blows to the king's torso. The king ignored the attacks entirely, diverting his gaze to glance at Colonel Norrit. The mud under his feet shook due to the blows landing on his torso, but his sounds remained as clear as always. "I let you both take my energy," the king exclaimed. "Is this the best you could do with it?" Colonel Norrit had barely gotten his wretches under control when something appeared before him. The king had reached him, bringing the kneeling Major General Ongen with him. The colonel didn't even think. His figure instantly became gaseous, exploding into trails of yellowish smoke that shot in different directions. Yet, the king was fast enough to catch part of that smoke, which vanished when he closed his hand. The yellowish gales converged in a distant spot, condensing into Colonel Norrit's figure again, only for pieces of his ribcage to be missing. A vast hole had appeared on his chest, exposing his left lung and parts of his beating heart. Major General Ongen kept attacking while the colonel collapsed into the sand, but that offensive wasn't even a slight annoyance for the king. However, it eventually claimed his attention, albeit for different reasons. "Your diversity is interesting, son of the Mana," the king admitted, slamming the general down, lifting waves of sand everywhere. "What would happen to it if I dismantled it piece by piece?" The general tried to struggle, but nothing could stop the king from reaching down to one of his horns and ripping it off. Chapter 1420, Newcomer. Colonel Norrit regained consciousness in time to watch the crushing defeat unfold. The king was still in his previous position, keeping Major General Ongen down while his free hand ripped chunks of his monstrous transformation off. The horns were the first to go, followed by the general's sharp nails. The king even ripped off his sharp metal fingers one by one before moving to his fangs. Blood spurted out whenever one of those body parts flew off, thrown away by the curious king. Major General Ongen also struggled to no end, unfazed by pain or notions of defeat, but nothing could oppose the alien evolved warrior. At some point, the king even rolled the general over, addressing the spikes on his back. Those bone-like protuberances snapped as if they were mere twigs at the touch of that black hand, but Major General Ongen only growled in anger at that agonizing pain, slamming his legs and arms onto the sand to try to fight back. Of course, nothing worked. The general had become the king's plaything now, and Colonel Norrit could only find comfort in the fact that his friend and superior had insane regenerative properties. Even his metal arm could regrow since it was part of him now. Nevertheless, Colonel Norrit also realized that the two of them had to escape that terrible predicament before thinking about recovering. Still, his body opposed his every effort to move or straighten himself. Colonel Norrit easily understood why. He only had to look down, digging his face through the sand to peek at the state of his chest. A large hole that left his lungs and beating heart exposed was still releasing blood onto the desert, showing no signs of healing. Evolved warriors existed past their physical limits, but the king seemed to have affected the colonel deeply with his simple grabbing motion. He had lost something important during that exchange, and his being would take time to refill that gap, leaving him powerless in the meantime. That outcome was beyond shameful. Despite being evolved warriors and relying on the mutagen, Colonel Norrit and Major General Arngen couldn't do anything against one of the Scarlet Eyes kings. To make things worse, Colonel Norrit realized another terrible detail. He saw how the king didn't use the glowing smoke on the back of his figure even now. His existence was simply on a superior level, and that was enough to dispose of ordinary evolved warriors. In hindsight, that outcome made sense. The Scarlet Eyes power classification wasn't exactly precise, but the kings obviously had to be far superior to the warriors. Yet, that difference in power remained shocking. Colonel Norrit couldn't move, but calculations flooded his mind, and the results were concerning. The mutagen could even the playing field, especially if the Allied front truly worked together to create a joint force. However, quantity wasn't the only issue there. Even if the Allied front could match the number of warriors in the Scarlet Eyes army, it would also need a way to deal with the kings. Based on what the colonel was witnessing, he didn't know whether his force had enough people at that level. There was also the infamous god to account for, whom Colonel Norrit couldn't even begin to consider. He was unable to comprehend how strong that king was, so something even superior was beyond the limits of his imagination. Once the king was done with all of the general's monstrous protuberances, he lifted him out of the sand to inspect his work. The titanic, fearsome demon was nothing more than a bleeding mess of holes and wounds now, but his body still tried to move, albeit weakly. The king didn't like that, so he threw the general away, who crashed into the sand and dug through it, disappearing underground, pushed by an unfathomable momentum that didn't match the casual gesture at all. The alien evolved warrior seemed to lose interest in his two human opponents at that point. He glanced in the distance, checking his remaining underlings, before stretching his right arm. The smoke on the king's back started to rise at that gesture. Tongues of that glowing, dense gas grew past his figure, seemingly wanting to stretch into the sky. However, Colonel Norrit saw how that growth suddenly stopped. The true chaos retracted toward the king's back while he glanced at the sky. Then, the colonel saw something he would have never expected the king to wear. The previous interest didn't return. Instead, a trace of seriousness invaded his face while his scarlet eyes descended toward Colonel Norrit. The colonel began to worry that the king wanted to finish him off, only to see that a pair of feet had appeared before him, blocking his view. Something also pulled him up, putting him in front of a blue glow. "You sure got beaten up pretty badly," a familiar, almost cheerful, voice reached Colonel Norrit's ears. "Ah, well, it's good that you showed up at all." Colonel Norrit was in no state to see past the blue glow. Part of him realized what was happening, but his thoughts focused on something else. "The general," Colonel Norrit whispered. Yes, I sensed him," the familiar voice replied, placing the colonel on what looked like a Thilku cape. "Though time sure flies. I wasn't told he had evolved, too." Being on the newcomer's back put the colonel before long strands of blue hair, basically setting his identity in stone. Still, Colonel Norrit couldn't linger in those thoughts when he saw that they were walking toward the king. Colonel Norrit couldn't think of anyone besides the newcomer who could handle the king. Still, he preferred the battle to happen when he was far away. Yet, to the colonel's surprise, the king merely watched as the newcomer walked right past him, reaching the place where the general had disappeared without triggering any attack. The colonel didn't have the time to worry about eventual excavations since the sand directly disappeared, creating a deep cavity that had Major General Arngen's maimed body at its bottom. The newcomer seemed to teleport directly there, leaning down to pull the general up. His skin was still dark red, and growls escaped his broken fangs once he sat up, vouching for his lost mind. His sanity looked gone, but the newcomer knew about a quite straightforward fix. "Shut it," the newcomer said, flicking the general's forehead, who slammed back onto the hole's bottom, fainting on the spot. The flick carried more than mere physical strength since the general's skin started to change after he fainted. His dark, reddish shades retreated, paving the way for his normal complexion. The demonic transformation as a whole reversed, but the colonel couldn't inspect the scene anymore since the newcomer grabbed the general and teleported out of the hole to return to the desert surface. "My wife will patch you up soon enough," the newcomer announced, completely ignoring the king to walk toward the intact parts of the city. "I'll take care of everything else." "As you wish," Colonel Norrit whispered, smirking as that reassuring presence made him relax, only leaving him enough awareness to add a few more words before fainting again. "Little shit." This concludes the chapters. Show your appreciation by liking this video and subscribe.